family on the loss of your brother, and my heartfelt condolences go out to you and to your entire family. And Ms. Underwood Jacobs, I offer my sincere condolences to you and your family on the loss of your dear brother. Mayor Morial, throughout recent times, we've seen repeated instances where Black people, often unarmed, have been killed by a police officer, and if the death results in a use of force investigation, that investigation most often is conducted by the law enforcement agency that employs the officer who used the deadly force. Isn't that correct?
That's traditionally the way it works.
And Professor Butler, we've also witnessed these use of force investigations being overseen by the local district attorney who works hand in hand, day after day, year after year, with the same officer and with the agency that employs the officer who used the deadly force in the case that's under investigation. Isn't that correct? Yes. And Attorney Crump, we've seen time and time again that the investigation becomes long and drawn out, and at some point, months or even years later, the local prosecutor takes that case before a secret grand jury, and out of that grand jury usually comes what's called a no bill, which is a refusal to indict the officer who committed the homicide. Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir, Congressman Johnson.
And Professor Butler, because grand jury proceedings are secret, the public never learns exactly what the prosecutor presented to the grand jury. Isn't that correct?
Just like the grand jury proceeding in Staten Island with Eric Garner, who was placed in an illegal chokehold, we have no idea why that grand jury didn't indict that officer for murder.
It becomes just another justified killing of a Black person by the police in America. Wouldn't it be fairer if the homicide investigation were undertaken by an independent police agency, Attorney Gupta?
I think it would. It would also give the community members much more faith in their legal system if there was an independent investigator in these kinds of cases.
And Attorney Eiffel, wouldn't it be better for the use of force investigation to be overseen by an independent prosecutor?
Without question.
And Professor Butler, wouldn't it inspire public confidence and trust if the law required transparency in the investigation and that the results of the independent investigation be made available to the citizenry within a reasonable period of time, but not 2 years later, like in the Michael Brown case in Ferguson?
Yes, Congressman. When an officer dishonors her badge by committing a crime, she should receive the same process as any other criminal.
Attorney Eiffel, do you believe that the Justice in Policing Act should require the withholding of federal grant funding to police agencies when the states in which they operate do not require independent deadly force investigations overseen by an independent prosecutor and police agency in police use of force, deadly use of force investigations?
I believe there needs to be an entire overhaul of the funding that goes from the federal government through the Department of Justice to local police departments to ensure that they comply with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits the federal government from giving money to local programs that engage in discrimination. And one way to ensure that this is not discriminatory is to ensure that there are independent investigations of police killings of unarmed Americans, and particularly unarmed African Americans.
Thank you. Last, Attorney Gupta, many police officers are protected from being questioned in use of force investigations because of so-called cooling off periods mandated under state law like in Minnesota or under labor contracts negotiated by police unions like the Fraternal Order of Police. Cooling off periods prohibit investigators from interviewing an accused officer for a period ranging from, say, 48 hours to sometimes as long as 10 days after an incident. They give police officers a chance to learn the facts uncovered in the investigation and also to create their storylines, get their storylines straight. Cooling off periods for police officers can undermine the integrity of investigations into police misconduct. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Is it time for the federal law to mandate restrictions on cooling off periods as has been mandated by Department of Justice consent decrees with police departments in Los Angeles, Seattle, New Orleans, Albuquerque, and also Portland?
Yes, the Justice Department specifically put those kinds of provisions into consent decrees because they were a real problem, not only in individual investigations, but frankly undermined the community's faith in the independence and fairness of an investigation with setting up two different sets of rules for people.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And coming together today, I'm reminded of something this committee has done before, and it goes back to Old Testament Scripture. It says, "Come now, let us reason together." And what the Scripture's telling us is that we've been confronted with the problem, and the question is for us is how do we deal with it? We've been confronted with the issue. The question is how do we deal with it? And what's concerning, and as I see this today, and from Mr. Floyd and Ms. Jacobs, the loss and the realness in your body language, in your eyes, and in your voice, is the pain of a nation right now coming to grips with conflicting issues and values in their head, wanting a safe and civil society in which all of us get along and in a way that should, in a society that we know doesn't. When you see your loved one murdered, when you find out your loved one murdered, in a time in which we're just all struggling. But it is not surprising to this committee. But it's unfortunate for this committee because in the previous Congress, we actually had a police working group in which we went to Houston. Chief Acevedo was there. We worked and we had a good couple of days of meetings. We went to Detroit. We went to Atlanta. We also had meetings here. And we were beginning these conversations, but we didn't continue. When this new Congress set in, we didn't do anything. And now we're here again, faced with a crisis of the moment. And Congress, unfortunately, lives by this seeming decree. Put it off until we have to have a hearing like this and we mourn the loss of the things most precious to us. My question is really, what can we do? And Ms. Jacobs, you said something earlier. It's talking about communities and jobs. It's about putting our communities together, the policing issue, and someone who is a son of a law enforcement officer. My father was a state trooper. I sympathize with this. I watched it. And one of the most grievous days in my father's ever memory is I remember when one of his own did something horribly wrong and they took him to prison. And it said, and the reason is he come home and I remember him being down and he looked at me and he said, the problem is, he said, everybody thinks I did it. He said, we got to get rid of that. But what have we done? There are things that we can do to help our communities. This committee came together on the First Step Act, on criminal justice reform, sentencing reform, working with the Senate to actually make a difference in our communities, to actually take the president who signed that, who made it a pillar of what he wants to do and sign it. That's what a committee together can do. We've not done that here. We've actually I worked with the late Elijah Cummings, chairman, on the Fair Chance Act. We talk about jobs. Then the Fair Chance Act was giving those with the criminal records a fair shot at applying for jobs because we unchecked the box where they wouldn't have to go through a screening beforehand. Let's see if they can actually set on their own and try a new chance in life. It's about making our communities whole again. And yet there are things in this bill that we can all agree on, but there's things in this bill that I wish we would take a little more time with. That we would just sit back and say, what is this going to happen? We've had task force set up with the Justice Action Network, COVID-19 Emergency Justice Task Force that looked at how we deal with our prison populations. A solicitor from my hometown, Stephanie Woodard, was a part of that. Others have been a part. This is a time for conversations to find good answers without unintended consequences. Ms. Bongino, I have a question for you, and it's been sort of intimated. Are there things about this that concern you? Not that they're not ideas that need to be discussed, but when you look at some of the issues around qualified immunity, some of the micromanagement in this bill, what concerns you when you see this from a law enforcement perspective?
Well, as the great Thomas Sowell says often, it's not what you do, it's asking and then what. Listen, I get it. There are serious issues with qualified immunity. Nobody on the panel's wrong, or on the witnesses either, bringing them up. There's no question about that. We're in full agreement. The problem is, if you were to repeal qualified immunity, have you considered and then what? Have you considered the fact that police officers' legal bills, some who may in fact deserve it for doing an awful job, but some who may not, will be so oppressive that you won't have police officers? Have you considered the fact that some of these police officers, out of fear of a rather litigious society we live in now, unfortunately, will now be afraid in the street to go and do their jobs and be proactive in communities that need it most? I mean, has anybody asked that question? Or are we just gaffing that off to create an interesting soundbite? The then what matters here, folks. Qualified immunity has issues. You can work around the edges, but the margins matter here.
And I think what we're bringing up here is not an issue that we don't need to discuss. And when we were discussing this through our police working group, we went to these communities, and I appreciate what you said, that it has to be it has to go both ways. The community and the police have to have these conversations both ways. I'm concerned here, and I appreciate that concern, because this is heading to where I know it always heads here. This is the hearing. Next week we mark up a bill. Next week it goes to the floor. Then we hope the Senate does something, and then we sort of go back and forth and hope that it gets right. My hope is that, Mr. Chairman, we get this right. We did it before. Let's make it happen again and take the comments of these committees on both sides. Mr. Crump and everybody, Mr. We can work on this. I've done it before. This committee has a history of working together. Let's do this, and let's get with the President and the Senate and make a difference so that lives are valued.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all of our witnesses for being here today. Ms. Underwood-Jacobs, I'm sorry for your loss. Mr. Floyd, I'm sorry for your loss. We're here today because of the long and growing list of Black Americans whose lives were taken from us prematurely at the hands of police. That's why we're here. George Floyd is the latest. Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, and far, far too many others. We're here today to keep this list from getting even one name longer. In this moment, we must dedicate and rededicate ourselves to working toward a more just and inclusive country. The violence and disregard for human life is what people were sickened by when they saw that awful video, Mr. Floyd. The fact that so many have marched representing the true diversity of our country, led by young people, all in the face of a pandemic, to speak out for others, shows just how tired our nation, our entire nation, all of us are, of seeing black person after black person killed by the police. The thousands and thousands of peaceful protesters across this nation deserve our attention. They deserve action, and the Justice in Policing Act is comprehensive reform that tackles the scourge of police brutality that has plagued communities of color year after year. Brutality that undermines and tarnishes the invaluable contributions of the honorable law enforcement officers who are just as heartsick as the rest of us at this problem. What we saw in the video of George Floyd's murder was the complete indifference to pain. Mr. Floyd was experiencing pain, and it was indifference to that human suffering, indifference to a death that was taking place in plain view. The indifference was cultivated by a culture without consequences. That's why we must provide accountability. We need better data collection on police misconduct and use of force. We need fair and thorough investigations by DOJ's Civil Rights Division that starts by giving them subpoena power to investigate allegations of police misconduct. And we need to know that police officers who violate the civil rights of Black Americans can be held accountable for their actions in a court of law. For Breonna Taylor, who was shot in her own home while the actual suspects the police were looking for were in police custody, we need to end the practice of no-knock warrants. For Sandra Bland, who was found dead in a jail cell 3 days after being stopped for a minor traffic violation, and for Philando Castile, who was shot 5 times while seated in his car during a traffic stop, we need to require police officers to wear body cameras and require police vehicles to use dashboard cameras. For Tamir Rice, a child who was shot by police while playing in a park with a toy gun, we need to help communities reform public safety and change the culture of law enforcement. And for Eric Garner, and yes, Philonise, for your brother George, we need to outlaw chokeholds. The Justice in Policing Act does all of this. It will provide accountability, it will provide transparency. And for our witnesses, I'd like to focus on what happens when troubled officers leave or are fired by one agency, then move to another, a system where police officers evade sanctions simply by moving jobs. We don't accept this for doctors who care for us. We don't accept this for lawyers who defend us. And we shouldn't accept this for officers who protect us. So the question I have with respect to Tamir Rice's killing by an officer who, as we heard earlier, lost his previous job as a police officer in a nearby suburb of Cleveland, was deemed emotionally unstable, an unstable recruit and unfit for duty. Ms. Gupta, what would a newly imagined registry that would require the law enforcement agency to report their finding of the officer's fitness for duty look like in that scenario?
Well, if there was a registry of the kind that the Justice and Policing Act it recommends, you'd have a national registry of all federal, state, and local law enforcement agents that would record misconduct complaints, discipline termination records, records of certification. It would be conditioned law enforcement agencies would need to put those inputs in order to get some federal funding. And the registry has to be public. And in the case of Tamir Rice, I will tell you, not just in Tamir Rice's case, but in many of the cases, I remember Justice Department civil rights prosecutors upset that they didn't have access to that kind of information in order not only for prosecutions, but also police chiefs. And Chief Acevedo just spoke to this earlier about the importance for chiefs to also have that kind of information available in making hiring decisions and the like. It protects the community.
Mr. Chairman, this is our civil rights moment. I pray that our committee and this body will rise to meet that moment.
We all agree. Time of the gentleman has expired. Mr. Buck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. George Floyd's death was senseless and tragic. I grieve for the Floyd family and look forward to justice being served. My heart also goes out to the family of Patrick Underwood, and I thank both of you for being here under these difficult circumstances. Yes, there are a few officers who are attracted to the uniform for the wrong reasons, who want the authority of carrying a badge and a gun but can't handle the responsibility. Some have anger issues, some mental health issues. But the bad cops are an extremely small percentage of the police officers in this country. And there's another side of the story. For 25 years, I prosecuted criminals working closely with great police officers and federal agents. Yes, I prosecuted and convicted some officers. But I also was at the bedside of officers after they had been shot trying to help someone. I've attended funerals for officers killed because they had the courage to wear the badge and do their job. I've been in the hospital trying to comfort one of my employees who learned just moments before of the death of her husband, a sheriff's deputy killed in the line of duty. Don't blame the police. It takes a special kind of courage to protect those who can't protect themselves, who care so much for their community they are willing to risk their lives to save others. When there is gunfire, violence, conflict, a few brave men and women wearing blue uniforms run toward the danger while others run away. Don't blame the police because they didn't create the policies that cause crime. And we all know the root causes of crime. Some don't like to admit their role in the breakdown of our society, but the people watching this hearing know. We commit a grave injustice to those who have died at the hands of police and those who have died at the hands of violent criminals if we don't deal with the root causes of crime. A comprehensive bill, as was discussed earlier, must recognize the societal impact of single-parent families, of substance abuse, of mental health issues, of a failed education system, and of transnational gangs. Defunding the police or otherwise handcuffing the police has its consequences. After the death of Freddie Gray in Baltimore, the police were severely restricted by the mayor and the Obama Department of Justice. In May 2015 alone, the month after 6 officers were charged for crimes a jury found that they did not commit, Baltimore saw 43 homicides, the city's deadliest month in 40 years. A New York Times investigation found that Baltimore ended 2015 with 342 homicides, a 62% increase from 2014. Let me repeat that. After Baltimore police were prevented from doing their jobs, the city suffered a 62% increase in homicides. There are also indirect consequences to restricting police enforcement. In 2017, Baltimore had 692 opioid deaths to go along with the 342 homicides. Chicago recently saw its most violent day in 6 decades. 18 people were killed on May 31st. While police were responding to riots downtown, residents of Chicago saw firsthand what happens when police are absent from the neighborhoods. To achieve justice for all, we should support investing in police protection in our most vulnerable neighborhoods, and we need to change the policies destroying our cities. Let's agree to empower good police officers to continue to protect and serve. Everyone deserves to be safe and secure in their home, on their way to work, walking to school, or throwing a ball in the park. Don't blame the police for our breakdown in society. They are doing their best to clean up the mess caused by politicians. Mr. Bongino, your thoughts about the causes of crime and the role of our police in this country.
You know, I read an interesting op-ed about 4 or 5 years ago, and in the opinion piece, they compared and contrasted two different areas of the country, one that voted largely for Mitt Romney in the election versus Barack Obama, one that voted largely for Barack Obama. It was an inner city in one case and an Appalachian region in the other case. Both considered failed by many measures: high crime, poor economy, poor healthcare outcomes. And what's interesting is it wasn't the voting patterns, it was the deeper patterns you're talking about there. Broken families, drug use, lax law enforcement. If we ignore that, and believe me, I am not in any way suggesting accountability for police and reforms are not necessarily. I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe that. But if we're going to ignore the societal problems and broken families and all of the degradation of the culture and all of that and just scapegoat the police, you will get nothing out of this hearing. You won't see one act of real change. You may get some sound bites, you may get some votes, but you're not going to see a darn thing change.
What I hear you saying is it'll be counterproductive.
It will absolutely be counterproductive. You will see nothing.
The time of the gentleman has expired. Ms. Bass?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's a couple things I wanted to say before I start my questions. It was said in the opening statement that the mayor of Los Angeles defunded the police department. I just wanted to make note that he absolutely did not defund the police department. He did reduce the budget, and he shifted the funds to deal with some of the real issues that police officers always complain about. Because how do they address some of society's problems like homelessness and mental illness? So he shifted the funding for that reason. I also wanted to follow up with Mr. Morial, who was describing a history of lynching. I just wanted to point out that one of the reasons, although you didn't say this, I would believe that one of the reasons you were talking about lynching is because in many of those cases, law enforcement officers were involved in the direct lynching, either getting the person, killing the person, et cetera. That was the relationship there. I wanted to also talk about qualified immunity and wanted to ask Mr. Crump if he would respond to that, because I believe one of my colleagues was mentioning what is the issue, since it is qualified, it's not absolute. So why do we need to do anything? Why would we need to change that?
Too often, what we have seen in courtrooms, especially when police have killed African Americans, especially black men, that the courts have interpreted this qualified immunity to almost give complete impunity to the police officers. That's why nobody is ever held accountable. When you think about that long list of Black Lives Matters names that we often recite to make sure that people know their life mattered. But if there's no accountability, Congresswoman Bass, it will keep happening. And we pray that George Floyd is the last one, but if this great body doesn't act, it's going to happen again, and I predict it's going to happen in the next 30 days.
Wow. What about some of the other professions that have this? Is it the same thing? You know, people have raised, a concern about child welfare workers or other people that have qualified immunity.
It only seems to be the police that has this great authority, this power that we've given them, and it goes unchecked. Every other profession, you're kept in check by the laws that govern this, but the courts have, I believe, unconstitutionally in many ways, given police this absolute blanket immunity, especially when it comes to black and brown people being killed by police. I mean, it's almost, you can count on one hand the people who actually go to jail for killing black people. Out of all those thousands of people since, Mark Morial said, since Trayvon Martin was killed, I think it was over almost 1,300. You can literally count specifically the number of times police have actually went to jail, and it is horrific, Madam Congresswoman.
Mr. Morial, having served as a mayor, I have often heard you say that you're one of the few folks around that have actually been involved in addressing this issue with the police department that you managed. Could you point out some of the specific things?
You know, we had I orchestrated a highly successful reform of a very broken police department, a city that had 500 murders a year, a city that led the nation in the number of civil rights complaints, a city that has 2 police officers on death row.
Oh.
We had to completely rebuild the department. And I said at the time that we were going to tear it down brick by brick, and we were going to rebuild it brick by brick. And at the end, we had a nationally accredited department. We took the murder rate down by 60%. We brought the civil rights complaints down to an infinitesimal number. We instituted community-oriented policing. And so the idea is obnoxious to me. And that somehow that if you hold police accountable, you're tying their hands from fighting crime.
Maybe Ms. Gupta could conclude on that to continue that response. Do we tie police hands by instituting these reforms?
I actually appreciate this question very much because just a few weeks ago, Richard Rosenfeld and Joel Wallman did a long study that they released in May of 2020, found no evidence for a Ferguson effect linking police killings of Black citizens to the homicide spike in places like Baltimore and other places via depolicing. There's been a lot of statements about that were very concerning in the aftermath of Freddie Gray's death in Baltimore. And there had been no data that had been actually collected and put out. And this study, I think, is a really important offering that belies actually that notion. And this notion that somehow when you protest racial injustice, that increases homicide rates in cities, this evidence actually says that's not true.
The gentlelady's time has expired. Ms. Roby.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are no adequate words I can say to take away the pain of those suffering across our country. Now is the time for understanding, and I am committed to listening and learning. First, Mr. Floyd and the entire Floyd family and loved ones, I'm deeply sorry for the loss of your brother, family member, and friend. No actions or words I can say here today will ever make you whole again, but please know how grateful I am for your presence here today, and I offer you my deepest condolences. And Mrs. Underwood Jacobs, your brother Pat was proudly protecting the community he loved, and I am deeply sorry for your loss as well. I hope you both will accept my heartfelt grief for you and your entire family. And to all of the families, like the Floyds and the Underwoods, who have had to suffer the tragedy and sorrow of losing a loved one due to needless violence, I also want to add my deep condolences. Today is a day to set our politics aside and focus on sound policies for our country. To all the witnesses, I have reviewed your written testimony. I have heard your verbal testimony, and I've listened to you answer questions from my colleagues. I want you to know that I am listening and I am learning and I hear you. I stand ready and I am hopeful. I am hopeful we can find bipartisan solutions and policies. Mr. Floyd and Mrs. Underwood Jacobs, I would like to give each of you the remainder of my time to address the committee.
Just sitting here, coming to try to tell you all about how I want justice for my brother. I just think about that video over and over again. felt like 8 hours and 46 minutes. Hurt seeing my brother plead for his life, watching that officer just put his knee on his neck. Just every day just looking at it, being like anywhere. That's all people talk about. The rest of my life, that's all I ever see. Somebody looking at the video. Kids had to watch the video. His kids had to watch the video. It just hurt. It's a lot of people with a lot of pain. My family, they just cry and cry every day and just ask why. Why? He pleaded for his life. He said he couldn't breathe. Nobody cared. Nobody. People pleaded for him. They still didn't care. Justice has to be served. Those officers, they have to be convicted. Anybody with a heart, they know that's wrong. You don't do that to a human being. You don't even do that to an animal. His life mattered. All our lives matter. Black lives matter. I just wish I can get them back. Those officers, they get to live.
Mr. Floyd, we grieve with you, and we appreciate very much your courage to be here with us today. My time has expired, but may Mrs. Underwood-Jacobs address the committee as well?
By all means.
Thank you, Mr. Floyd.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Congresswoman Roby. I have to say that I'm heartbroken. I didn't get a chance to say goodbye to my brother either before he was killed. I am also heartbroken for all of the other people that are in this country living every single day and feel unsafe just to drive to the store. I also have had the talk with my son. We sit here today at somewhat opposite ends of the spectrum to a certain degree, but yet there is so much commonality amongst both of us. And the heartbreak and the grief is inexplainable because it's very, very hard to articulate when your entire world has been turned upside down. I do want to know, though, when I think about all of this, is that my brother wore a uniform, and he wore that uniform proudly. I'm wondering, where is the outrage for a fallen officer that also happens to be African American? So as I'm sitting here and I'm listening to all of you and us, I truly hope that you take your positions, your offices so seriously that you want to go back and really work together and collaborate. Because if you can't get it right, there's no hope for the rest of us. So when you go back and you convene and you talk through everything that's going on, I hope that we're just not people on paper, but the fact that you could be able to see our faces and feel our pain and feel it enough that you want to make change for all the citizens of the United States of America.
Again, we grieve with you both, and we thank you very much for your courage to be with us here today. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back, Mr. Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very rarely am I at a
I'm at a loss of words or know where to start. And I want to start with you, Miss Angela Underwood-Jacobs, and just say that you have my condolences, my sympathy, and my prayers. And unfortunately, this was the hearing you were invited to. You were not invited to the hearings where in Homeland Security we talk about the threat to our law enforcement officers that put on blue and black every day. The fact that we tried to get more vests for police officers and the other side fought it. The fact that we wanted to fight sovereign citizens that's killed more police officers in this country than anybody else and the other side fought it. But they invited you to this hearing, and I just want you to know that we have fought for increased survivor benefits for the families of officers, and we respect those who serve our communities. And then, Mr. Floyd, Falonis, let me just tell you that when I met with you in Houston and your family, the remarkable thing is you all asked for two things, neither of which was for you. Justice for George and a just society. And that's why we're here today. And the unfortunate part is in this process, we speak and we leave. But there's one thing that I want to address. Mr. Buck came and said that it was politicians that has messed up the family unit in America. That could somewhat be true. But for him, how do you ignore the white man's knee on the neck of black people for 401 years and act like that has nothing to do with where we are? But part of the reason why I am so encouraged today is more people are recognizing that now, and the systematic racism and oppression that has existed, that we're now coming together to fight and establish a solution. It was Dr. King in his letter from a Birmingham jail that he actually responded to his critics for the first time, because he said that he would assume they were people of goodwill with sincere concerns. Over my better judgment, I will assume the other side is people of goodwill and sincere concern in some of these arguments why we can't or shouldn't pass this bill. But the other part I want you all to understand is the outrage that I have. Because it was 1988 91 when the movie Boys in the Hood came out. And the last line in the movie said either they don't know, they don't show, or they don't care what happens in the hood. Well, if you didn't know, now you know. Because the protesters, the peaceful protesters out there are showing you what's happening. Video footage is showing us what's happening. So then you go to the last line, and the real question is, do we care? And I believe that this piece of legislation is a good piece of legislation that moves the ball forward. It is very easy to sit on the other side and let perfection be the enemy of the good, or just sit back with inertia and we never move the ball forward. We have an obligation to the next generation of kids, to men and women walking the streets now, to make sure we move the ball forward. You know, every once in a while, we've tried it the other way all this time. We're just asking you to try it our way this time. Let's pass some legislation. Let's hold the bad police officers accountable. And we always say bad apples. Well, the saying is enough bad apples spoil a bunch. So let's make sure that we're talking about it. Mr. Mayor, in 30 seconds, and I know I used up all the time, I was a beneficiary of your reforms. And what you did was you moved some resources from a constitutional police department that you created to after-school funding and things that the community can do better than police. 20 seconds. Can you explain that? And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The disinvestment in those types of programs over the last 20 years, and some of it's happened in this Congress. The elimination of a summer youth employment program, the elimination of supports for children. Baltimore City no extracurricular activities in any of the schools. So we can fix policing with this, and we need to do some other things to address those other systemic issues. And you're right, I moved $1 million the first 30 days I was in office from police overtime to create a summer jobs program because there was no money. And the summer jobs program and the camps for kids and the outdoor camps for inner city kids that didn't cost a dime, that gave kids, a person like you, a chance to work at LSU Dental School. Those made great differences. And part of this conversation about, quote unquote, don't want to open a Pandora's box, defunding police is really not about defunding police. It's about funding other things that have been ignored and forgotten, investing in young people and youth. You're a middle-class parent in America today. Your kid wants to go to dance class, you pay. Karate, pay. Little League Baseball, pay. Inner city kid, no opportunity if it's not provided by the public dollars. You go back to 1950s and 60s in America when immigrants made up the vast majority, European immigrants made up the vast majority of major American cities, and you had free recreation programs and free summer camps. And on our watch, as these cities have changed, somehow, some way, a lot of that has gone away. So we're there trying to patch together dollars and patch together work. So it's important to understand this bill is about reforming policing, which is a pillar. There's a separate discussion and an additional discussion that needs to be had about how we do all the other things. And I want to work with you all on that, but don't confuse the two. I mean, that's the thing. People want to confuse the two. And just I'll say respectfully, bad family situation didn't kill George Floyd. That's right. Sir, that's an outrage. It's an absolute outrage to think that a bad family, I am tired of trying to change the issue when we have police brutality and police misconduct to this rhetoric about bad family situations. It's an insult, and it needs to stop. It needs to stop. I sit, I take it, I listen, but not at this moment. Not at this time. Let's fix policing in America. Let's focus on that. There's ample time to do other things. As I said earlier, it's a moral moment. It's time for that. We're called to act. Yes, figure out a way to do it in a bipartisan way. But go back and look. On the other side of this Capitol, there are 2 office buildings named for United States senators, both of whom have a legacy of what we're talking about today. One is Richard B. Russell, a man who led the filibuster against the anti-lynching law for decades. The other, Everett McKinley Dirksen, a Republican from Illinois who provided the courage to help President Johnson pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's the moment we're in.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm struck today by a lot of the testimony and that we're hearing some of the same recurring themes. And it is a moral moment, Ms. Morial, my friend from Louisiana, as you said. One of the recurring themes that we've heard many times this morning from members and witnesses is about the need to rebuild relationships. You know, one of the founders, I think, I can't remember who it was, said there are thousands hacking at the branches of evil to one who's striking at the root. And one of those root problems in this moral moment we face is that we don't know each other anymore. You know, that's kind of how society and culture have evolved. And we all agree on the objective, I think, obviously, by the comments this morning of rebuilding relationships. But I think we need to drill down a little bit. Public policy is one thing, but this is a hard issue, as we all agree. And to determine what the best, most effective methods are to achieve that objective that we all agree on. So I just wanted to ask a couple of our witnesses, beginning with Mr. Crump. I appreciate what you said this morning. We had a little sidebar over here, and I like the heart that you bring to this issue. And I wanted to ask your opinion on that, because you mentioned that in your remarks about the need to build relationships. And so from your experiences and everything you've been doing, what do you think are some ways we can do that between members of our communities and law enforcement officials?
Certainly. Thank you, Representative Johnson. I do think we have to work together. At the crux of the matter, it's a lack of trust, I believe, between communities of color and law enforcement, because we have to have transparency, which we haven't had in the police killings of black people. As one of the witnesses said, you go to a secret grand jury proceeding like Eric Gardner or any other cases, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, and they come back after the secret grand jury and say, no indictment, we didn't find evidence, even though we all saw it with our eyes. And so you have to have transparency, and then you have to have accountability, and that's how you get to trust. I think you said something that I agree with. It's about transparency, it's about training, and then termination. And we gotta terminate police. We don't do it. I mean, we just don't do it. We don't send them to jail. We don't even fire them when they kill black people. And so, as Philona said, we gotta care. As Representative Richmond said, do we care? Because our actions don't construe that. And so first we gotta just get to the core. It's transparency, accountability, and then maybe we can get to trust, because we do see it from the other side that black people, the prison, industrial complex, school to prison pipeline, you see it all the time, you going to jail, but then when we're the victim, you don't see convictions like Eric Gardner or any of these other cases.
I appreciate those comments, and I think that it goes even more fundamental than that, in that it's the relationships even in the communities. Before you can get to building trust, with law enforcement, it's with our neighbors too, right? I was on the phone last night with the local director of our YMCA, and he had this idea to host, to use the YMCA facilities in my community as a neutral forum where he would have these events, an activities night, Saturday night or maybe Sunday nights, and he'd invite one black church and one white church, right? Just put everybody together in the same facility and let them get to know each other and have fun together. And just simple things like that I think we ought to foster and try to encourage. And it doesn't have anything to do with the law, really, or public policy. It's about being good Americans and good neighbors, and I hope we can get back to that. And maybe this is a flashpoint to do it. If Mr. Davis is still with us, I know he was with us remotely. I'm really interested in his experience at DOJ and the community-oriented policing services, and I know that's a big function of this as well. I wonder if he could speak to that issue, if he's still with us on the idea of building those relationships and community policing as an important function of that.
Yes, Congressman, I am still here, and thank you very much for the question. And I would say with the COPS office, it has a great opportunity to actually do that, to facilitate community policing. And that's really his charge. It's his charge to be able to identify the best practices of community policing, how to engage through our grant program, to incentivize best practices through our grant programs, our hiring process. We are hiring in the spirit of service. And so I think it does help out a lot. If I can say one thing, Congressman, the key to that is there are over 16,000 individual police agencies in the country. Most of them are 25 officers or fewer. So without the help of the COPS office or the federal government, it is hard to infuse those types of training and information and best practices. And so the COPS office is a key as a linchpin to make sure that whether it's 2 officers or 4,000, that they have the opportunity for best practices. But that was our goal, was to advance community policing, and this still probably should be the goal today. I do say we have stepped away from that, from a lot of the programs that we were offering at one time.
Thank you. I'm out of time. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Jeffries.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The chokehold and other police tactics, such as a knee to the neck, are inherently dangerous and present an unreasonable risk of serious bodily injury or death. That is why the Justice in Policing Act will make such strangulation tactics unlawful pursuant to our nation's civil rights laws. President Davis, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, supports criminalizing chokeholds and other strangulation tactics as a matter of law. Is that correct?
This is for Ron Davis. Yes, sir, it is.
Ms. Gupta, does the civil rights community support criminalizing chokeholds and other strangulation tactics as a matter of federal law?
We do, and in fact, there are departments around the country that have already banned them, and so this is about making that the national standard.
Professor Butler, Is it fair to say that the neck should be off limits during police encounters?
Use your mic, Mr. Butler, please.
Thank you, sir. When the police use pain compliance techniques like neck restraints, it prevents blood and oxygen from going to the lungs and brain. There's a great risk of death.
Black Lives Matter, yet month after month, year after year, decade after decade, the list of tragedy continues to grow. Amadou Diallo, dead. Sean Bell, dead. Eric Garner, dead. Tamir Rice, dead. Walter Scott, dead. Oscar Grant, dead. Yvette Smith, dead. Stephon Clark, dead. Breonna Taylor, dead. George Floyd, dead. But Mr. Bongino, the police are at times able to show restraint under very difficult circumstances. Is that correct?
Of course.
Let's review a few examples. In 2012, James Holmes entered a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado, and opened fire on an audience, killing 12 people and injuring 70. Mr. Holmes was heavily armed with an AR-15, 12-gauge shotgun, and 40 caliber handgun, yet he was taken into police custody outside of that very same movie theater without incident. Mr. Bongino, James Holmes is white, is that correct?
I'm not sure of his background. I don't know James Holmes personally.
He's white. 2014, Dylan Roof massacred 9 black parishioners at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston. Mr. Roof was heavily armed with a high-powered Glock, 45 caliber pistol, and 88 rounds. The police somehow arrested Dylan Roof without incident and even treated him to Burger King. Mr. Bongino, Dylan Roof is white, is that correct?
Yeah, I don't know where you're going with this. So if he's white, that doesn't make him any better, or it was an awful thing he did, whether he was white or black. I'm
Correct.
not sure where you were going with this.
Dylan Roof was white. And last year,
He's awful.
in El Paso, Texas, Patrick Crucius killed 23 people and injured dozens during a shooting rampage. He used an AK-47 and was heavily armed. Yet somehow he was arrested without incident. Mr. Bongino, Patrick Crucius was white, is that correct?
Sir, I have no idea of I don't know his parentage.
He was white.
Again, I don't know why you're making a racial thing.
Reclaiming my time.
Yeah.
Because Black Lives Matter, sir.
Yeah, all lives matter, sir. Every single life matters. White, black, Asian,
Professor
everywhere
Butler,
else.
you have heavily armed mass murderers in places like Aurora, Charleston, and El Paso, somehow apprehended by police without incident. That's the point, sir.
I arrested those people, sir.
Innocent,
You didn't.
Innocent, unarmed African Americans are repeatedly killed in police encounter after police encounter. Is it fair to say that the difference, which seems explicable, in police behavior somehow relates, at least in part, to race?
In law and in police practices, black lives do not have the same value that white lives have.
All we simply want is for every single community, regardless of race, to be able to breathe the free air of liberty and justice for all. That's what the Justice in Policing Act is all about. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're here because we've recently suffered multiple failures of law enforcement, beginning with the killing of George Floyd. He died because a rogue cop with multiple complaints for misconduct was allowed to remain on a police force. as did one of his accomplices. This has become an intolerable pattern in big city police forces, and we need to ask how politically powerful police unions and the politicians they maintain in office protect the bullies in the system that inevitably lead to atrocities like this. The other failure was the decision to withhold police protection from their citizens by mayors and their appointed police chiefs. That failure killed Pat Underwood, killed David Dorn, and so many other innocent victims in the ensuing riots. Withdrawing police protection from our streets, abandoning police stations to rioters, turning a blind eye to looting, arson, and mayhem, all have an incendiary effect on insurrections. Without law enforcement, there is no law. And without law, there is no civilization. An accounting of the deaths and destruction caused by these acts of dereliction have yet to be tallied, but it's going to be staggering. Now, we meet today to chart a course forward, and I think we can look to no better guide than Sir Robert Peel, the father of modern policing, who set forth principles of law enforcement for a free society nearly 2 centuries ago. And when you read them, you realize how far we have drifted from these moorings. Central to our discussion is his 7th principle, quote, to maintain at all times a relationship with the public that gives reality to the historic tradition that the police are the public and that the public are the police. The police being only members of the public who are paid to give full-time attention to duties which are incumbent on every citizen in the interests of community welfare and existence, end of quote. So how do we get back to these principles? I think there are many proposals that have been raised in the House that merit support. And first is the doctrine of qualified immunity. As it's currently applied, it has no place in a nation ruled by laws. For every right, there must be a remedy. And qualified immunity prevents a remedy for those whose rights have been violated by officials holding a public trust. And this reform should apply as much to a rogue cop who targets people because of their race as it does to IRS or Justice Department officials who target people on the basis of their politics. Reforming qualified immunity simply holds public officials to the same standards as any other citizen exercising the same powers. Second, police records must be open to the public. It is a well-established principle that public servants work for the public, and the public has a right to know what they're doing with the authority the public has loaned them. And police departments should be able to dismiss bad officers without interference from the unions. By preventing the public from access to these records and preventing departments from acting on them, we destroy the very foundation of successful policing in a free society: public trust and accountability. Third, turning police departments into paramilitary organizations is antithetical to the 6th principle laid down by Peel, quote, to use only the minimum degree of physical force which is necessary on any particular occasion for achieving a police objective. Weapons that are unique to a battlefield need to be limited to a battlefield. Fourth, no-knock warrants have been proven to be lethal to citizens and to police officials for obvious reasons. The invasion of a person's home is one of the most terrifying powers the government possesses. Every person in a free society has the right to take arms against an intruder in their homes. And that means that the authority of the police must be announced before that intrusion takes place. To do otherwise places every one of us in mortal peril. So I think these 4 reforms are legitimate powers for the federal government to uphold the constitutional rights of its citizens. But it's not within our legitimate power to dictate training and procedures for every community in the country. As Peel counsels us, effective law enforcement is a community endeavor, and every community has different needs and different circumstances which require different standards. One-size-fits-all bromides are at best ineffective and at worst dangerous. And then finally, lest we forget, when faithful, dedicated, honest police officers, and that is the vast, vast majority of those who serve us, when they are attacked and degraded and disrespected and demoralized and hamstrung and withdrawn, those most at risk are the poor and the defenseless who live and work in our inner cities. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Escobar.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and Chairwoman Bass. I'm so grateful for this piece of legislation and for your leadership. I want to thank all the panelists who are here with us today. Mrs. Underwood Jacobs, I want you to know that we hear and we feel and we see your pain, and we are praying for justice for you and your entire family as well. Our sincerest condolences. Thank you for being here. Mr. Floyd, thank you for your incredible courage. I cannot imagine the strength that it took to be here with us today, but you did it. I want you to know that for those of us who are mothers, it tore us up to hear your brother call out for your mother. We heard him and we hear you, and we are going to continue to fight for justice for as long as we can. You know, people are marching in the streets all over this country and all over the world, marching for justice, marching to force us to rise to this moment. And it is our obligation and our duty to rise to this moment. I have heard from many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle their desire to work in a bipartisan nature on this bill and to achieve an outcome worthy of the American people who have entrusted us in this moment. And so my request today of my colleagues for the remainder of this hearing, for our markup next week, and for the day that it comes to the floor, let us focus on what is in the bill, not what is not in the bill. I've heard a lot of conversations from this dais about issues that are being debated outside of this room. Those debates are important, those debates are healthy, those debates are part of American democracy, but they're not in the bill. If we truly are going to come to a bipartisan agreement and provide for this country the justice that it is seeking, let's focus on what is in the bill. Mr. Butler, Professor Butler, we have heard much about the disproportionate impact that police brutality has had on the African American community. And we have also heard much about the fact that, well, let's focus on family, well, let's focus on God. And no one disputes that as a country and as a government, we should be making investments in education, investments in healthcare, investments in community. But in terms of really fully coming to grips with what is happening in terms of race and law enforcement in this country, we know that unarmed Black Americans were 5 times as likely as unarmed white Americans to be shot and killed by a police officer. To what do you attribute that fact? And your microphone, please, sir.
A legacy, Congresswoman, of white supremacy, a legacy of slavery and Jim Crow segregation, and then an evolution from the old Jim Crow to the new Jim Crow, where the stereotypes and the biases against people of color don't go away, but they just take different forms.
That's absolutely correct. Mr. Floyd, I want to ask you, as a Black man in America, do you live in fear that you will one day be a target as well?
Yes, ma'am. Every day I walk around, I ask myself, am I next? Am I next all the time? Because I don't want to do anything wrong to make anybody think that I'm doing wrong. So just try to live life and just have faith and hope everything comes out the right way. But basically, that's it. Just a black man just trying to go to work every day and go back home safely. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Floyd. If we are truly to come to an agreement on this legislation, if we are truly to rise to this moment, we have to acknowledge the truth that is looking at us in the face every single day in America. We have to rise to this occasion. We have to do justice. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I start, I'd like to just point out something. When we started, Mr. Floyd spoke first, and it was very passionate. I was very moved. But then, for some reason, you didn't have Mrs. Underwood Jacobs speak about the loss of her brother, and it really surprised me, quite frankly. And I thought it was very disrespectful. I don't know if that's what you meant, but I wanted to say that. I want to thank all of you for coming here, and I'm very sorry for your loss, Mr. Floyd, and for your loss, Ms. Underwood Jacobs. You know, I have 2 black grandsons, and so, you know, I haven't experienced the discrimination that some of you have experienced, that you have told us about, but I sure don't want them to be discriminated against. So this is very important to me. But there's another thing going on here that I just want to read some tweets. This is very disturbing to me. First of all, in early June, Brian Fallon, the executive director of Demand Justice and the former press secretary to Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign and spokesman for Attorney General Eric Holder, tweeted, "Defund the police." On June 5th, Representative Ilhan Omar, who represents Minneapolis in Congress, tweeted, "The Minneapolis Police Department has proven themselves beyond reform. It's time to disband them and reimagine public safety in Minneapolis." Minneapolis City Council member Jeremiah Ellison, son of Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison, tweeted, "We are going to dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department." Lisa Bender, the president of the Minneapolis City Council, tweeted, "We are going to dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department." I read that Patrice Cullors, a co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement, wants to see police forces abolished entirely, eventually. And Steve Fletcher, Minnesota City Council member, also stated that he and City Council President and the chair of the Public Safety are calling to disband our police department. Mr. Borgino, I am a survivor of domestic violence from a previous marriage. And I remember when my neighbors called the police. And I don't know why, but I disputed. When the police came to the door, I said, "Oh, I'm fine. Nothing happened. Everything's good here." If we disband, dismantle, defund, reduce funding in the police, what's going to happen to the woman that calls out, who's a victim of domestic violence? What's going to happen to response time? What's going to happen in that situation, do you think?
Well, I became a police officer. I wanted to be a doctor precisely because in a situation, without rendering any further embarrassment to people in my family, the police officer showed up and dissuaded a member of my family from doing something he shouldn't have been doing. And this person wasn't scared of anything. He was only scared of the police. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean, he didn't want to go to jail. It's the only thing, I was about 9 or 10, it's the only thing that brought peace to me that night. I knew I wanted to be a cop the moment after that. You know, this defund the police abomination will lead to a catastrophe like you've never seen. I can't emphasize that in strong enough terms. I worked in a largely minority precinct, East New York, Brooklyn, the 7-5 precinct. It's a tough place to work. I was young, I was in my 20s. The only time I was ever physically attacked by someone was in a domestic violence situation. I have nothing but the utmost respect for social workers, medics, EMTs, and firemen. I mean that. Running into a burning building is tough. Saving someone's life and catching a pulse in the last minutes, that's tough. But when I walked into that house, make no mistake, that man, and forgive me for not saying my sincere, my heartfelt empathy with you for having gone through that, having lived through it myself, I should have opened with that. I mean that. But that man in that house, I'll never forget it. He wasn't going to be stopped. There was no negotiating. This isn't a movie, folks. This is real. He wasn't going to be stopped from attacking his wife. There was a 5 or 6 year old, I don't know the age, cowering in the corner. I've told this story recently because it's so tattooed on my brain, I'll never forget it. You know what that's like? Cowering in the corner. You know, the daddy stop. The guy wasn't going to be stopped. He didn't care that we had guns. You think he's going to care if it's a social worker? Again, I'm not sure where this ridiculous absurdity of defunding the police came from, but I didn't come here with some partisan agenda, and frankly, I'm deeply offended at some who've made it so, including mischaracterizing my comments by Mr. Muriel, which was offensive to me, too. You can pound a table all you want, but that's not what I said. Black families matter to me, too. That was my point. Not that the tragic death of Mr. Floyd had anything to do with that. But what about black families that are the subject of domestic violence? The guy I stopped hit me with an ironing board, you know that? And luckily my partner was there to save me, and that woman, and that crying 5-year-old child.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
Thank you.
Jayapal.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Floyd, please accept my deepest condolences for your brother's death. It is one too many deaths that result from centuries-old pervasive violence and anti-blackness at the hands of the police. I promise you that we intend to honor George Floyd with the most sweeping changes to policing that this House has seen in recent memory, banning chokeholds, no-knock warrants, making lynching a federal crime, and investing in community-based models that provide community safety for all. That is all we can do. We cannot bring him back, but we can honor him with real change. I want to bring into this room the name of Charlena Lyles, a pregnant Black woman and mother of 5 in Seattle, and with her, the many Black women across the country who have lost their lives or their children. 3 years ago, the Seattle Police Department responded to a call from Ms. Lyles, who had been flagged as someone with mental health issues. The officers had received crisis intervention training, and they did know about her mental health issues. And yet, before attempting non-lethal methods of de-escalation, they fired 7 rounds, killing her in front of her children. Her 2-year-old son climbed onto her body and laid in her blood. This brutal story is one of far too many. It's not enough just to say Black Lives Matter. We have to do the work to cement this essential principle into policy and practice, and it's why we must pass as a critical first step the Justice in Policing Act. Professor Butler, I want to start with you. Is any amount of crisis training to teach officers how to interact with individuals with mental health issues sufficient in and of itself to overcome what we're calling the warrior mentality that exists within law enforcement?
Congresswoman, if the culture of police departments isn't shifted away from that warrior mentality, then no other reform would matter. Guardianship is the model that President Obama's commission recommended. If you think about it, if you're applying for a job as a warrior, you're going to have one resume and one group of skill sets. If you're applying for a job to be a guardian, to be a caretaker for your community, you have a different resume and a different set of skills. Congresswoman Lesko, thank you so much for sharing your story. I heard that story as a failure of policing. What I imagined what if responders had shown up who understand what your experience is like as a survivor. It's too often the case that survivors don't go to the police or shun the police because the police aren't going to give them the service that they need. Imagine if a guardian had shown up instead. What a difference that might have made.
Thank you, Professor Butler. Ms. Gupta, as you know, the Seattle Police Department is in its 8th year under a federal consent decree that was based upon DOJ's finding that excessive force was most often used against people of color and those who were either mentally or chemically impaired. And as you know, initially there were some wonderful positive changes that occurred. However, 8 years later, we have run into some roadblocks where reforms recommended by the Community Police Commission that were set up were ignored by city leaders and not incorporated into police union contracts. And the recent protests on the streets here in Seattle have been met by a police force that uses use of force against peaceful protesters. You have talked about a phrase, culture eats policy for lunch. Can you explain what that phrase means to you and what tools within this bill are most important, and what else is needed to truly bring about justice in policing that meets the cries of the protesters on the streets?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the success of any kind of long-term reform effort or a consent decree, Congresswoman, is where there's leadership and there's an effort that is sustained over time to change the culture of policing. It is what Professor Butler was alluding to just now. And it doesn't happen overnight, but it requires sustained commitment. And I look at Justice in Policing Act and I look at the provisions in there that are seeking to ensure accountability, because when people feel like their police department can act with impunity and no accountability, when police officers feel like there is no accountability or consequences on the other side, the culture of a police department becomes very hard to change. And no matter how many policies you change, how much you overhaul in terms of the policing manual and the like, the culture piece is actually the thing that takes the longest amount of time to shift. It requires constant and persistent leadership at the top, and it requires a commitment to changing and reflecting a system of policing that is much more guardian-oriented than warrior. I will also say that I think right now there is a hunger in the streets and in communities around the country to recognize that people want other options in their communities other than to call 911 and have a police officer come at the door when people are in mental health crisis, for homelessness issues and school discipline issues. And they want to, and I've heard this from police chiefs, the International Association of Chiefs of Police issued a very powerful statement 2 days ago recognizing the systematic decades of underinvestment in the kinds of social systems in housing and homelessness and education, and how that's all been placed at the feet of police officers. And so there is this needs to be a holistic evaluation of what spending priorities have been in communities that have been saturated with a criminal justice response, but underinvested with resources for education and jobs and the like.
Thank you, Ms. Gupta. Mr. Morial, let me end with you. We recognize, as Ms. Gupta was saying, that too often. Has my time expired, Mr. Chairman? I can't see the timer.
The time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A lot of important things have been said here today, but maybe the most important and frankly the most succinct was a statement that Mr. Floyd made earlier at the prompting of very first round of questioning from Mr. Gates when he asked Mr. Floyd to respond to something Ms. Underwood Jacobs had said during her testimony. And he said, "Life is precious. Life is precious. George Floyd's life was precious. Pat Underwood's life is precious. Life is precious." Our country, the greatest country ever, started on that premise. The document that launched this experiment in liberty we call America says this: we are all endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are what? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think it's interesting to think of the order the founders placed the rights they chose to mention. Can you pursue your goals and dreams and happiness if you first don't have liberty, if you first don't have freedom? And do you ever have liberty and freedom if government won't protect your most basic right, your right to life? Because Mr. Floyd is right. Life is precious. Mr. Bongino, you agree with that statement? Life is precious?
Absolutely.
And you protected it every day in your job, your previous job. Is that right?
The best of my ability.
You were a New York City police officer. You protected life every time you put on that uniform and did your shift, did your service. Is that right?
Proudly so.
And when you were in the Secret Service, you protected life. You protected some pretty important life.
Barack Obama, President Bush.
Two presidents of our great country.
That's correct.
And when you protected that life, you actually risked another precious life. You risked your life. Is that accurate?
It's accurate.
And officers do that every single day, don't they?
8 hours a day, 5 days a week.
Every day. And that is why you have been so strong in your language about this concept of defunding the police, abolishing the police, a policy proposal that is not consistent with the statement made, the best statement made here today by George Floyd's brother, which says life is precious. I think in your testimony earlier you said, if police forces are abolished, if police forces are defunded, it's not some, I think you used the word amorphous mass, or we're talking about human beings. We're talking about officers who put on the uniform and go protect our communities. It will put their lives at risk, won't it?
There's absolutely no question.
And just as importantly, because life is precious, it will put people's life at risk in the communities those law enforcement officers serve. Is that accurate?
That is accurate, and anyone supporting this should take an oath today to go to the many funerals of the thousands of black lives, Hispanic lives, and white lives that will unquestionably be lost in the chaos that ensues in depolice streets. You should commit today and raise your right hand to go to those funerals and listen to those crying parents watching their sons and daughters in those caskets. You want to vote for it? Then you go see the consequences of it, because the streets will be chaos. And you can't run away after that. Everyone will know what you did if you choose to go down this road.
Let's protect life. Let's recognize exactly what Mr. Floyd said. Life is precious, and let's do that. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Swalwell.
Thank you. And first, to Ms. Underwood-Jacobs and Mr. Floyd, my condolences to you. Ms. Underwood-Jacobs, the Bay Area law enforcement community grieves with you. My younger brother was working just 2 blocks around the corner from where your brother was that night when he passed, and we grieve with you, and we'll work to try and find his killers. Mr. Floyd, we know a lot about what happened to your brother because of a citizen's video, but let's say we didn't have the video, just the report, and too often that's what we're left with. And in that report, a statement issued by the Minneapolis Police Department, they said that after Mr. Floyd got out, he physically resisted officers. You've watched that painful video. Did you ever see your brother resist officers?
David, you take the chair for a couple of minutes. Yeah,
Like, I'm too emotional right now to just talk about a lot. I'd rather just have my attorney.
The officers, it also said the officers were able to get the suspect into handcuffs and noted he was suffering medical distress. Mr. Crump, did you ever see that? Other than the distress of an officer's knee on his neck, did you see what was described in the statement released by the Minneapolis Police Department?
No, sir, we did not. The video, we saw him face down in handcuffs.
It also said, at no time were weapons of any type used by anyone involved in this incident. Well, you had a highly trained and experienced police officer using his knee. You would agree that that knee in that case was a weapon, is that right?
Absolutely. For 8 minutes and 46 seconds.
A weapon used for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And too often in our criminal justice system, the deck is stacked against persons of color because of statements that are falsely made in police statements and then put out to the public when there were no cameras, no public footage. And Ms. Gupta, do you believe that the Justice in Policing Act, by having a body camera requirement, an independent investigation into misconduct, and a national police misconduct registry could go a long way to make sure that we don't have more false statements?
I think the Justice in Policing Act contains several provisions that are really, really important to transforming the culture of policing in America, yes.
And I was consulting with an African-American member of my community last week at a church, and he told me something that you said, Mr. Floyd. It sounded identical. He said, I feel safe 2 times during the day. When I wake up in my own home, and when I come home from work to my own home. In between, I drive a nice car that I worked hard for, and people in my community think I stole it. I often see police officers pull up behind me and run my license plate and then drive off because they know I don't have any warrants. What was shocking about that statement was that was a police captain of one of our biggest law enforcement agencies in the Bay Area. If he doesn't feel safe as a police captain How can people who don't have the resources that he has feel safe? But I want to talk about something else that you mentioned, Mr. Floyd, because we're here because individual tragedies and institutional tragedies continue to persist. And unless we do something now, they'll continue. You talked about the officers there not listening to your brother. On January 1, 2009, in Oakland, California, unarmed Oscar Grant laid on his stomach as an officer shot him in the back. And his last words before he died were, "You shot me. I have a 4-year-old daughter." On July 2014, Eric Gardner in a chokehold in Staten Island, gasping to say, "I can't breathe," before he died. No one on the scene heard him. And your brother, Mr. Floyd, on May 25, a police officer with his knee on his neck, as your brother said, "I can't breathe. I want my mama. I can't breathe." And the officers on that scene did not hear your brother. Because of this tragedy, the world is listening now. What do you want them to hear?
I want them to stop hiring corrupted police officers. I know it's no way to figure out who's good and who's bad, but we got to find a way, because your heart has to be big if you're an officer. You just can't use the badge to be able to do what you want to do when you want to do it. You're supposed to serve and you're supposed to protect. I didn't see anybody protecting and serving that day when my brother was on his front, on his chest, hands behind his back, pleading, "Please, please, I can't breathe." A grown man, 46 years of age, crying for his mom. Just hurt, just looking all the time. People try to show it to you, figuring it out. They lynched my brother. That was a modern day lynching in broad daylight. People was out there pleading, "Please, please, get off, he can't breathe, he can't breathe." People were video recording it. Nobody cared. Nobody. My brother, he lost his life before 8 minutes and 46 seconds. He went unconscious. His life was gone. They just dragged his body across that concrete, his lifeless body. Every day, I'm gonna have to live with that. My family's gonna have to live with that. His kids are gonna have to live with that. I just don't know. Right now, I'm happy that we are getting one step closer to justice, but for the time being, I still need time to grieve with my family, because I haven't had that chance yet.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Rushenthaler is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to say thank you to all the witnesses who came here to testify today. Mr. Floyd, Ms. Underwood Jacobs, it takes an incredible amount of courage to come here and talk about this after losing a loved one. So I know I speak for all my colleagues when I thank you for your willingness to come here and share your stories with this committee. And as Leader McCarthy said earlier today, George and Patrick will not be forgotten. Everyone in this room agrees that police officers who abuse their power must be held accountable for their crimes. But I hope that we can also agree that the vast majority of law enforcement officers choose their line of work because they want to protect their communities. They put themselves in harm's way every single day, and they do it to keep us and America safe. In southwestern Pennsylvania, we've seen firsthand how the selflessness of the police actually saves lives. In 2018, 11 Jewish worshipers were killed by a hateful, anti-Semitic madman at the Tree of Life synagogue. The Pittsburgh police and police from around the region ran into open gunfire, and if it were not for their heroic efforts, the tragic loss of life could have been much worse. So that's why I'm incredibly alarmed to hear calls from the left to defund our nation's police departments. And those on the left can try to minimize this, but I just heard my colleague from Arizona go through a litany of statements from those on the left that are calling for defunding and dismantling police departments. I think that if anything, the murder of George Floyd demonstrates the need to invest more in our police departments. We should focus on improving training to promote good police practices. We should also be providing mental health care, especially for those that are struggling with PTSD and other job-related stresses. Additionally, we should work to build stronger bonds between law enforcement and the communities they serve. We can start by having school resource officers in our schools. But I recognize, we must recognize and we must empower good police officers while terminating bad actors. With that said, Mr. Bongino, do you think that defunding our nation's police departments is an effective way of addressing instances of police misconduct?
No, it's a disastrous policy. And I think one of the issues that hasn't been considered are the second order effects. I mean, obviously the first order effects are quite obvious. Less police on the streets means more crime. There's simply no deterrent to crime unless you trust in the goodness of every man's heart, which would be potentially disastrous. You are going to have more crime. But think about the second order effects. Has anyone on the panel considered the brain drain that would happen? You will have child abuse investigators who have a very unique ability. They've accumulated over time to look a child in the eye and know right away when they're trying to protect an abuse of a parent because they've been threatened. I've seen it. What about child sexual abuse online, where some of these people, they can look at an image and tell 6 different degrees of separation, how that person got there and who that abused child is? You're going to defund them too? What about the latent print officer that shows up at your house for a burglary that's been taking fingerprints for 20 years? You're going to teach someone that in 5 minutes in a social worker police academy? Again, God bless our social workers. That's not what they do. What about the homicide detectives I worked with? When I was a young rookie Secret Service agent, I couldn't break a guy on an interrogation. I couldn't get him to admit the crime. He didn't want to admit it. We had a guy walk in, he walked in, knew how to interview. Within 5 minutes, we had a full confession, admitted to everything, because he'd done it before. And he knew exactly the back and forth of interview and interrogation. These are skills that are going to be missing from our streets. You don't understand the catastrophe that would follow. And I can't emphasize in strong enough terms a disaster this would be if anyone follows through on it.
Thank you, Ms. Bongino. And I want to talk about the effect this would have on the communities that are most vulnerable. For example, affluent communities, if the police forces were dismantled and defunded, those affluent communities would just hire private police firms. In fact, there's anecdotal evidence that's already happened in some places. But could you talk about the effect, the sad irony we would see if this happened and what it would have on the most vulnerable communities?
Yeah, think about it. With the 7-5 precinct in East New York, Brooklyn, where I worked, a couple of years before I got there, they had more homicides in that one precinct in New York City than the entire city of Baltimore had a few years ago. By the time I got there in the 90s, they had cut that down to such a point that the entire crime rate in New York City was almost equivalent to that of Baltimore City, a city multiple times the size. This will save real lives if we increase our police, not decrease our police budgets. That's insane.
Thank you, and I yield.
I now recognize Mr. Liu for his questions for 5 minutes.
I want to thank Chairman Nadler and Subcommittee Chair Bass for your excellent leadership on this outstanding legislation. We are here because Black Lives Matter. And most Republican officials have been unable to say those 3 words. The President has been unable to say it. The Attorney General hasn't said it. And the overwhelming majority of Republican senators and House members have not said it. Why does this matter? Because you can't fix the problem if you can't even identify the problem. This is not a problem of a few bad apples. This is systematic institutional racism against Black Americans. Our life is precious. Black lives are subjected to much higher risk of brutality from the police than white lives. That's what the data shows. We know, for example, that Black Americans are killed at a rate twice as high from police than white Americans. Our government murdered George Floyd and countless Black Americans. And it wasn't one rogue cop. who put his knee on George Floyd's neck. There were an additional 2 police officers who had their knees on George Floyd's body, and then a 4th officer who stood as a lookout, and then a Minneapolis Police Department spokesperson who gave a completely misleading initial account of what happened. And then there were the officers and civilians at the department who knew about the 18 misconduct claims against Derek Chauvin and didn't take strong enough action. It takes a village to allow for the persistent, systematic murder of Black Americans by our government, and this has got to stop. The Justice and Policing Act takes a critical step to stopping the state-sanctioned police brutality against Black Americans. It has a lot of great provisions. First one I'd like to focus on is training. Now, is training going to stop bad cops from doing bad things? No. But it might help good cops from doing bad things. I note for the record that in terms of training hours, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, police recruits spend on average 840 hours in basic training and 500 hours in field training for a total of 1,340 hours. In California, to be a licensed cosmetologist requires 1,600 hours. So in other words, it takes more training hours to be a hairdresser than to be a police officer. Now, just as important as the number of hours is how we train our officers. I'm very pleased that this legislation requires training in racial bias, in racial profiling, and in procedural justice. My first question today is to Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis, when you testified before this committee last September, you talked about procedural justice. Can you explain what procedural justice training is and why it's so important?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, I can. The basic concept of procedural justice is the evidence that shows people comply with the law, not because they're afraid of the police or even going into custody. They comply with the law because they're giving a voice. They believe the law is fair and equitably applied, and that the process will be fair to them. We know this over the years when people get tickets and we survey them. How they're treated determines their view about that process more than whether or not they got the ticket. So this idea of procedural justice is a way to obtain compliance, how to get people to themselves, but to comply. And it should be trained so that officers know how to gain compliance, how to give people a voice, how to recognize how they treat people has a greater impact on how they respond to that authority than anything else.
Thank you very much. My second question is to Ms. Ifill. Recently, Attorney General Bill Barr stated that he didn't think there was systematic racism in law enforcement systems. Do you agree with him that this is just an issue of a few rogue cops rather than the systems we currently have in place?
Not only do I disagree with him, but if Attorney General Barr would consult the reports issued by his own department in pattern and practice investigations in over 24 jurisdictions throughout the country, he would learn that systemic racism actually exists in police departments around the country that has been fully investigated and found by the Department of Justice, who've sued those jurisdictions and put them under consent decree. The bad apple theory of policing reform is a failure. It looks only at individual officers instead of the system in which they operate. And if we want to change culture, if we want to change relationships, then you have to change the rules that govern that system. There's no change that happened in this country, especially culture change, that happened because of midnight basketball or that happened because we all got in a room and ate together. We didn't end racial discrimination and segregation in schools by all getting together and having a meeting. It actually required law to make it happen. We didn't end the barring of women from being hired in certain professions by having a conference. It required the law. And now we have found a systemic problem that has been with us for decades that requires law to actually change the context in which policing happens in this country, and to give us a chance to make and to look at public safety more broadly than we've done in the past, and to make police officers accountable within that system of public safety.
Thank you very much. The time of the gentleman has expired. I now recognize Mr. Klein for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Across the street from the Capitol, above the Supreme Court, is inscribed "Equal Justice Under Law." Today, I stand with my fellow Americans in condemning the brutal killing of George Floyd and so many others who have been denied that equal justice under the law. Mr. Floyd, Ms. Underwood Jacobs, we grieve with you and we mourn with you. You have our sincere condolences for your loss. Mr. Floyd's killing was an outrageous act of violence committed by a member of law enforcement with a long record of over a dozen citizen complaints. With the recent arrests of the former officers involved, I look forward to justice being served, and being served quickly. But for so many others, they will not see that justice served. In the time that has passed since Mr. Floyd's murder, many more examples of injustice across the nation have had the spotlight shown upon them, including Breonna Taylor in Louisville, who was killed by officers in her apartment when a no-knock warrant was served at her residence by officers looking for suspects. American justice should be served in a court of law, but sadly, many have been denied this right, having been killed while being brought into custody. Mr. Chairman, in my district office, I have a copy of one of Norman Rockwell's 4 freedoms, the freedom of speech, one of the freedoms given to us by our Creator and a cornerstone of American democracy. As we mourn the death of George Floyd, we're also witnessing Americans who continue to exercise their First Amendment rights to peaceably assemble, protest Mr. Floyd's death, and highlight other instances of police violence across the country and the need for significant, real reform. Congress should continue to work together to find solutions to these pervasive problems and ensure that all Americans are being afforded access to equal justice under the law. I believe there are many ways we can continue to work together rather than put forward policies that divide us. This committee has a long history of working together to find bipartisan solutions on issues facing our justice system. The First Step Act, just 2 years ago, reformed our federal criminal justice system. This act included provisions focused on reducing recidivism, reforming incarceration policy, correctional reforms, sentencing reforms, and improved oversight. Many of the policies included in Chairwoman Bass's bill are ideas that can achieve that bipartisan consensus once again. Increased data collection about officer-involved shootings, body cameras, outlawing chokeholds, making lynching a federal crime, demilitarizing our police forces are all areas where we can potentially find that bipartisan consensus. Although we may need to review certain tactics and methods used by law enforcement, we cannot continue to consider the irrational and ridiculous notion of defunding, disbanding, or eliminating our police departments. The rule of law is foundational in the United States, and we must advance solutions that provide fair access to justice while enforcing our laws. As John Adams said, we are a nation of laws, not of men. The vast majority of those who serve and protect are good people and stand firmly against the violent and hateful actions of bad officers. At the same time, we cannot ignore the need to have dialogue and understanding when confronting difficult issues like the ones before us today. We must also look at the departmental policies that are keeping bad officers in their positions. A substantial number of collective bargaining agreements among police departments limit officer interrogations after alleged misconduct, mandate the destruction of disciplinary records, ban civilian oversight, prevent anonymous civilian complaints, indemnify officers in the event of civil suits, and limit the length of internal investigations. Instead of efforts pursued by the majority to expand police unions, we should be limiting the scope of their collective bargaining and ensure that laws already on the books aren't hampered by contracts that they've negotiated, such as the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, whose effectiveness has been diluted because DOJ's attempt to reform police departments must work around the terms of collective bargaining agreements. Mr. Floyd, you just said we might not be able to tell the good cops from the bad, but we should be able to keep the bad ones from coming back. This is a time for personal and national reflection on how we can be better neighbors and better citizens of the greatest nation on earth. I truly hope we can seize this moment in time so that Americans can come together, and I hope as legislators we can come together to craft solutions to make our community safe, strengthen the bonds that unite us, and ensure that we can live out God's direction in Micah 6, chapter 6, verse 8, to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Floyd, I have a brother, too, whom I love very much, and I cannot imagine your pain right now. My heart goes out to you, and I want to just say you've been a wonderful brother to your brother and a great citizen today. So thank you for sticking with us. Professor Butler, the whole point of the social contract is that we'll be safer inside of it rather than outside of it in a state of nature or state of war. That's why our Constitution protects life, liberty, and property against arbitrary deprivation by the government. Now, this legislation that we're looking at today, the Justice and Policing Act, will ban chokeholds, strangleholds, no-knock warrants, racial and ethnic profiling. It'll criminalize lynching. It will end the militarization of local police departments. It creates a national police misconduct registry. It strengthens the standards of police accountability. My question for you is, given that you're someone who studies this for a living and teaches about it, is the social contract working for African Americans today with respect to policing? And if not, will this legislation actually vindicate the value of human life that members on both sides of the aisle have spoken about?
Indeed, Congressman. I was so moved by Mr. Johnson's introduction when he talked about the dignity of every human life. And then we heard Ranking Member Jordan echo Mr. Floyd's heartfelt plea that life is precious. The Justice Act of 2020 reaffirms the sanctity of life. It establishes national standards for when the police can legally kill people and requires officers to employ de-escalation techniques. The Act states that cops can only kill people as a last resort and requires them to try to de-escalate the situation before resorting to deadly force. This is common sense, but it's not the law now.
Thank you. Ms. Gupta, do you agree with Mr. Crump that we should impose the traditional doctrine of respondeat superior, let the master answer for the employee on police departments so that they have the proper incentives to carefully train and supervise and monitor their officers?
Yes, I do.
Ms. Eiffel, Mayor Morial spoke of the history of lynching and racism and the cycles of American history, and there have been two other moments in our history when America moved aggressively to try to transcend the original curse of violent white supremacy. One was Reconstruction, which lasted 12 years after the Civil War before it was undone by racism. And the second was the modern civil rights movement, the so-called Second Reconstruction, when the blood sacrifice of Dr. King and Schwerner, Chaney, and Goodman and Medgar Evers and Bob Moses and our colleague John Lewis and many others gave us the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And this civil rights movement, this Second Reconstruction, also faced a violent backlash. What are our prospects for a third and enduring Reconstruction today, Ms. Eiffel? What needs to happen for us to transcend the nightmare of racist violence and injustice that we seem to have been trapped in?
Well, thank you. Well, for purposes of this hearing, every member of this body has to take responsibility for what is happening in this country and decide that they will put behind them their election prospects, their sound bites for Fox News or for any other news network. They have to decide that they want to get their hands around this problem. And that means working together to try and solve what the people in cities in every state in this country have told them over the last 2 weeks is a problem that people will not tolerate anymore. It takes courage. It is going to take a lot of work for all of you in that body to come together. But this bill has provisions that I believe you can agree on from what I've heard today. And I would encourage people to read the bill. This bill does not repeal qualified immunity, for example. It actually changes the standard that courts have distorted over time. Read the bill. There is nothing in this bill that should be objectionable to anyone who cares about public safety truly, who cares about anti-discrimination and pledges themselves to it, who cares about the rule of law, and who cares about this country, and who believes, as many have said today, that they owe something to Mr. Floyd and his family, and even to Ms. Jacobs and her family. because police officers are made unsafe by the current system.
Thank you.
I would encourage people to read the bill, and I would encourage people to step up with courage, not only in this body, but in state and local governments as well, and to decide that they want to work together to solve this problem that the people have said
Thank you.
cannot wait anymore.
Thank you, Ms. Eichfeld. Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent request that I would like to propose, if that's all right.
Go ahead.
A number of our colleagues have denounced several episodes of violence that have marred the beautiful and massive nonviolent protests that are transforming America today, and I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the following articles: white supremacists and other extremists exploiting this moment in the Richmond Times-Dispatch, far-right infiltrators and agitators in George Floyd protests, indicators of white supremacists in just security, and Facebook removes nearly 200 accounts tied to hate groups encouraging members to attend protests over police killings. And that is in ABC News.
Without objection, and the gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you.
Mr. Stubbe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Floyd, I would offer my personal condolence to you in the loss of your brother. I can't imagine having to watch your family member die needless and merciless passing. And I feel confident that not only justice will be served for him, but I think that significant and necessary reforms will come of this tragic incident. And I wish Ms. Underwood Jacobs was still here, but I also want to give my condolence to her. Hopefully she'll watch the video. I have a brother and a father in law enforcement. I cannot imagine the pain that you are experiencing knowing that someone intentionally targeted him simply because he was an officer. I'm very sorry for your loss, and my prayers are with you and your family and with Mr. Floyd's family. In my prayers this morning, Philippians 4:13 came to mind. So I hope that you all can reflect on that. This is a dangerous, dangerous time for law enforcement and their families. Just in the conversation I had with my brother yesterday, he said he had 2 of his deputies quit because all of the issues that they are facing, threats, targeting, being reconned on their homes, their vehicles being looted and broken into at their homes. And speaking of law enforcement officers, I also like to give condolences to the family of the retired police captain, David Dorn, who was fatally shot last week trying to prevent a pawn shop from being looted during what the left is calling a peaceful protest. His life mattered as well, and I commend his service to his community as a law enforcement officer and wish that there was a member of his family here represented today to give their remarks in his passing. While officers like David Dorn and David Underwood have been targeted and murdered during these so-called protests, it is extremely troubling that many of my colleagues on the left have failed to condemn the violence and rioting in our cities and communities across the country. Protests are peaceful. Looting, killing, stealing, destruction, and burning some of the very cities where their leaders just weeks ago were arresting people for violating stay-at-home orders is absolute lawlessness. And the hypocrisy of these leaders arresting those violating stay-at-home orders for, say, going surfing or other activities, gathering in a synagogue with 10 or more people. The hypocrisy of these leaders arresting those individuals for violating stay-at-home orders, but sitting by while their cities burn is outlandish to me. On one day alone, on May 31st in Chicago, one city, on one day, saw 18 people murdered due to rioting in one night. The deadliest day in Chicago in 60 years. There were over 65,000 911 calls. And can you imagine if we abolished the police department, those 65,000 people would be calling and nobody would be there to come to their rescue? That is not America. That is anarchy. And when your leaders talk about disbanding police departments, you are emboldening criminals to continue to commit crime, knowing that there will be no one to stop them. I talked to my brother yesterday, and they had an incident at a Walmart where there were 30 individuals looting the Walmart that my wife and I go to on a pretty regular basis. And they only had 3 officers respond to 30 individuals who had weapons. Well, they're not going to use 3 officers to respond to 30 individuals because of the safety risk incurred to those officers. Those 30 individuals got away. I thought that Pastor Scott had a great statement today in his opening comment. Pastor, you said the prospect of defunding or dismantling our police forces is one of the most unwise, irresponsible proposals made by American politicians. And I would agree. There are issues in this proposal that we can all agree upon. A law against lynching, which I supported in this House passed months ago. which we voted for earlier this year. Ensuring bad cops don't get rehired at different agencies. Absolutely, that's an incredible idea. Reporting use of force in an FBI database. And creating a commission on social status of black men and boys based on a Florida program that I participated in as a Florida senator in the state of Florida. And I was proud to be a part of that program. But there are proposals in this bill that are extremely dangerous for those who protect our communities. Removing qualified immunity is only a protection if officers follow their training and protocols. If they don't follow their training and protocols, they don't get to use the immunity because it's qualified. If officers don't have qualified immunity to follow their training and protocols, I don't know a single person who would want to become a law enforcement officer in today's world, knowing that they may or may not be able to use the training and protocols that they were used to be able to apprehend a suspect who is not complying with them. But maybe that's the goal of the majority, to get less and less people to join our law enforcement offices. One quick point in the little time I have left is military equipment, or as Mr. Raskin calls it, the militarization of our police departments. They use bulletproof vests and bulletproof shields to protect our officers who protect our communities. By stripping them of that ability and stripping them of their ability to use weapons to protect themselves is a dangerous, dangerous path to go down. And I don't think that our country supports that. And Mr. Floyd, I think, said it best. You said, life is precious, and I would agree with you. And I would contend that all life is precious and all deserves protection. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Demings.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I also want to mention our subcommittee chair and thank Chairwoman Bass for her leadership. Thank you to all of the witnesses and for your endurance. It's worth it. Mr. Floyd, my family and I, along with my constituents in Florida, join you in grieving the death of your brother, George. I know that Ms. Underwood Jacobs is not here any longer, but my family and I and my constituents also join her in the death of her brother, Patrick. I have attended many law enforcement funerals, more than I care to admit, and we are outraged about both deaths. But let me say this. As law enforcement officers, we are held, they're held to a higher standard. I'm sure Ms. Underwood Jacobs' brother deserved to wear the uniform. Everybody does not. And that's why we are here today. I come before you as the mother of 3 beautiful black sons. I also come before you as a former social worker and a former police chief. Many have tried to frame this tragic event as an us versus them situation. That's not what this is. This is not about the community being against the police or the police being about the community. It's much bigger than that. This moment is about what's right, and this moment is about what's wrong. This is not a black issue or a white issue. It's not a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. This is an American issue that has turned into yet another American tragedy. We all have to get this right. Lord knows I want to get this right. While the actions of one brutally murdered took the life of your brother, Mr. Floyd, 3 other officers did nothing about it for 8 minutes and 43 seconds. I have been on the street, and I know what it feels like to be waiting for backup to come. 8 minutes and 46 seconds feels like a lifetime. That's a long time. And while one officer took the life of Mr. Floyd, 3 others stood by and did nothing for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Chief Davis, would you talk for just a moment about an officer's duty to act in general An officer's duty to act. For example, if they received a call for service, does an officer have the ability to simply refuse to go to that call? And certainly when they see a crime in progress, a wrongdoing being perpetrated by a fellow officer, please talk about their obligation to intervene and also report to the agency that bad behavior. Chief Davis.
Thank you, Congresswoman, and I agree with you 100%. That is why one of the things I asked for earlier was the reaffirmation of the oath of office, because the officer takes the oath to the Constitution to protect and serve, and they have a duty to serve. And we say against all enemies, foreign and domestic. They have the duty to take the calls that they're sent to. They have the duties to enforce the law, and most policies require the duty to intervene. And so they were morally obligated, they were procedurally obligated, they were legally obligated to intervene with Mr. Floyd's murder. They're legally obligated to respond to the calls. We expect them to go to active shooters. We expect them to go to bank robberies, domestic violence, and we also expect them to be consistent. And so anyone that's violating the law should be held accountable, and is not a pass because you wear the badge. So as you know, as a chief, as I just spent 9 years as a chief, it should be held to a much higher standard, and that standard includes the duty to intervene, the duty to report misconduct, the duty to render first aid, because those are the high standards of this profession.
Thank you so much, Chief Davis, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure that a at-large representative from a state that is 89% white and 100% rural is always the best person to address these issues, and I don't pretend to be. But we neighbor Minnesota. Minneapolis is a city that is far and away the closest to North Dakotans' hearts. And on May 25th, we watched in abject horror as your brother was brutally murdered. And on May 27th, our entire state mourned because Officer Cody Holte was killed trying to save another officer who had been wounded, independent of anything else that is going on in the rest of the country. And the very next Tuesday, we buried Officer Cody Holte, and it was an incredibly beautiful and incredibly tragic funeral. Yesterday, I watched your brother's funeral, and it was incredibly beautiful and incredibly tragic. But you know what I found through the whole course of all of this? None of it was binary. I agree with Congresswoman Demings. This is not enough us against them. This is not that situation. We can do reform. We've done it before. We've done it in states like North Dakota. And I hope when we go through a markup that we are willing to work through this, because I think you'll find there are a lot of people on my side of the aisle that agree with a lot of the concepts on the other side of the aisle. But I will view this bill the same way I view every other bill. How does it work at 2:30 on the side of the road in a state where it's often one officer, and by the way, not just for the officer and the person being detained, but how does it work at 2:30 on the side of a road where backup is measured in hours and not minutes? Because my concern with these things is always, I don't pretend to know how to police in urban districts. I don't live in an urban district. But you have to recognize that as we intend to do these things, we have a high turnover rate. We have a hard time hiring law enforcement as it is in North Dakota. We have to make sure that it can work everywhere. But if it comes to holding bad cops accountable and bad departments accountable, I'm all in. Because once they wash out everywhere else, they might end up where I'm at. And we don't want that either. But after that, I think I would go with, I hope I can give some people some hope. Because regardless of how this works next week, and regardless of what we mark up, what we move forward, we shouldn't be done. We should continue to work towards other things. And those things are disparities in sentencing, disparities in pretrial release, things that we quantifiably can show exist. In 2016, and this is primarily in state court because it's about 88% of the prison population in the United States is in state court. Black prisoners serve essentially a 5-to-1 prison sentence on drug crimes than white prisoners. Now that's down from 16-to-1 in 2000, but it's pretty hard to pat yourself on the back for something that shouldn't exist in the first place. And what we found is that as we move forward, and we dealt with minimum mandatory sentencing, and minimum mandatory sentencing was supposed to be to get rid of disparity in these sentences. But what we found is blacks are almost twice as likely to be charged with a minimum mandatory offense as white. So instead of taking it out of the court's hands and the judge's hands, we've moved it into prosecutors' hands. Pretrial release, as we continue to do this, states have done this. North Dakota has done this. Working towards issues that allow for people to be released based on risk assessment, not monetary value. Those types of things work. And this matters on the street because you know if you're going to get arrested that you're not going to get out. The likelihood of you resisting, absconding, all of those different things goes up significantly. And we can do that. We should look at policies that are racially neutral on their face, but have a historically disparate racial impact. School zone enhancement for drug crimes. As we've seen this go on years after years, these enhancements have gotten larger and larger, and they also tend to be in highly urban, densely populated, poor neighborhoods that are predominantly African American. Those enhancements need reform. We need to look at those things, and those are things we can continue to do, and I will continue to do with everybody on the other side of the aisle. And my point to this is not to deflect. We've heard all of these different things today, but I want my friends on the other side of the aisle to know that we can do this, and I know we can do it because we did it in North Dakota. And if we can do it in North Dakota, we can do it absolutely anywhere. But it takes working with each other, and it takes working with each other on both sides of the aisle. So no matter how we move forward on this and continue to work, I want you all to know there are people on our side of the aisle that are committed to working on these issues that will have real positive impact for people all across this country. And it's not just about what we have going on now, it's how we continue to work in the future. So reach out, ask us, we're here to help. Thank you all.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler and Chairwoman Bass, for holding this most important hearing. And Mr. Floyd, I want to thank you for being here today in this very difficult moment for you and your family. The murder of your brother, George Floyd, reminds us all that the relationship between public safety and those who they are sworn to protect can't be assumed to always be one that's a healthy relationship. In my district, the new Ellis Island of the United States, we're diverse and we're always changing. New Americans live side by side with the greatest generation. We have to remember that we are not a police state and we are not a police country, and that for public safety officers to do their job, trust and cooperation are essential. We've worked really hard over decades, the last few decades, to bring that trust into being, and that's why it is so sad to see again another murder, another tragedy in our streets. And this is exactly why this bill has to become law. When I was a California legislator, this issue kept popping up over and over again. In my work with the autism community, this issue again resurfaced about a decade ago. As police began to confront the tidal wave of maturing autistic children, we soon realized that police officers were not trained to deal with autistic adults. Autistic individuals not capable of following directions were considered to be uncooperative, and soon violent confrontations arose and were reported in the press. My work in this area in updating California police officer standards was soon brought to the attention of a retired police chief in the Midwest, the father of an autistic adult who was also trying to address the issue of autism in public safety. This clearly shows that police training is not a local issue, but a national issue. And again, this shows why this bill must become law. The Justice Policing Act of 2020 improves police training and practices by creating law enforcement development programs to develop policies, best practices, among others. In my legislation, H.R. 5251, Improving Community Safety Task Force, directs the Attorney General to also establish a task force seeking ways to reduce violent clashes between communities and public safety officers. And Mr. Chairman, at this point, I'd like to submit for the record a letter from Brian Marvel, President of the Peace Officers Research Association of California, discussing how they support reforms.
Without objection.
And Mayor Underwood, I want to let you know that your family's loss, your brother, will also not go forgotten. I have a question for Professor Butler. Welcome, first of all, sir, and welcome to all the witnesses.
Thank you, sir.
I'd like to take a moment to discuss arrest disparities. The ACLU has said African Americans are almost 4 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis possession. For Washington, D.C., you have stated that African Americans are about 50% of those that use cannabis, yet they account for 90% of the people who are charged with marijuana crimes. Is that correct, sir?
Yes, sir.
How do you think the legalization of cannabis will help with social justice in this nation?
We think it would help create equal justice under the law. We know that for drug crimes, African Americans don't disproportionately commit those crimes. National Institute of Health says that we don't disproportionately possess drugs. Most people report buying drugs from someone of their own race. If you go from NIH and Bethesda to the Bureau of Justice Statistics in DC, they'll tell you 60% people locked up for drug crimes are black. About 15% of people who do the crime, 60% of people who do the time. That's unequal justice under the law.
So would you say that we're mixing criminal justice with social issues, with medical issues when it comes to our national drug policy?
The drug addiction issue is an issue of public health, as is the issue of the epidemic of violence in communities. It's a public health issue, not exclusively a criminal law issue.
Thank you very much, and Mr. Chair, I yield.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you. First, of course, I want to join my colleagues in expressing our condolences to your family, Mr. Floyd. I cannot begin to imagine the pain of having to relive that video over and over again. I just want to thank you for having the strength to speak here today, to share George's story and his spirits and his words with this committee, but also with the country. And I'm sure that your brother would be proud of you. Our hearts and those of every thinking and feeling American are with you and your family, and we're committed to making the changes that we need to ensure that you, your family, and every family in this country receives the equal justice and the security that our Constitution and our most essential American values demand. We're here to listen and to confront the harsh truths about racism in our country and the law enforcement practices that for too long have allowed police violence against communities of color and especially Black individuals. The murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, and on, have once again brought these truths to the surface, that centuries of systemic racism and inaction have resulted in a justice system that harms Black communities and policing practices that disproportionately kill Black Americans. This is unacceptable. We must change. America must change. And Americans have taken to the streets in peaceful protest all across this great nation, in big cities and small towns, to demand that change. We are witnessing a long overdue moral reckoning in our country, and each of us must examine how to be agents of that change, because we have a lot of work to do. Change must come at the local, state, and federal level. Just as cities and states are reckoning with ways to protect communities and hold law enforcement accountable, Congress must do the same. I want to thank all our witnesses for helping us understand the changes we need to make to achieve justice for all Americans, particularly which ones are uniquely crying out for federal solutions. Having worked for decades as a public interest lawyer, I'm particularly interested in some of the legal fixes that this bill provides. I know that sometimes small changes in a statute can have enormous implications for holding powerful institutions accountable, and the bill we're considering contains a few of those. Ms. Gupta, one of the ways that police officers can be held accountable is a federal law that makes it a crime to violate someone's civil rights, including by using excessive force as a police officer. But in its current form, it's very difficult to get a conviction under that law because it requires proving that the police officer willfully violated a person's civil rights. Can you explain how changing the statute to require a reckless standard instead of willfulness would improve police accountability?
Yeah, so the Justice Department currently only has one law that they can use to prosecute police misconduct. And as you said, it has the highest mens rea requirement there is in criminal law, requiring not only that prosecutors prove that the officer used unreasonable force, but actually also that the officer knew that what he or she was doing was in violation of the law and did it anyway. That is actually a very high burden. And so for years, there have been case after case that the Justice Department has been unable to reach because of how high this burden is. There are many criminal civil rights prosecutors that for years have also wanted the change that is being proposed in the Justice and Policing Act, because I think it would enhance the Justice Department's credibility in these matters to be able to hold officers who violate federal civil rights laws accountable. And so the Justice and Policing Act asks it change the mens rea standard to knowingly or with reckless disregard. It's a slightly lower standard, so more cases will be charged. It also really importantly broadens the language of the federal civil rights statute by including in its definition of a death resulting from an officer's action any act that was a substantial factor contributing to death. And I know many, many former U.S. attorneys that are eager to see this change as well.
I actually was approached by one of those former U.S. attorneys at my train station this week saying this was probably one of the key provisions. It looks like the time has expired, so I yield back. Thank you.
The gentlelady yields back. Ms. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses. I thank you for your patience. I know it's been a long day, but certainly the topic is worthy of that time and probably more times of discussion before we ultimately vote. To Mr. Floyd and Ms. Underwood Jacobs, we certainly accompanying your grief. I know you and I visited just a little bit at the funeral yesterday in Houston. Please know that you have my heartfelt condolences. You know, I have 5 brothers. You know, sometimes they beat up on me a little bit, and sometimes they were helpful, and sometimes they were just brothers. So I know how important that is, so I grieve with you. Mr. Chairman, I wish that we were here today under different circumstances. Instead, we're here because our nation is struggling to heal after witnessing the horrific murder of George Floyd. As a person of faith, I was taught at an early age that we are all children of God. George Floyd was not treated as a child of God during his final moments on this earth. Mr. Floyd, I stand with you and your family, and I stand with Black and brown Americans and all Americans across the country who just want to live and breathe without fear. I stand with my colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus as we demand for America to live up to its values. We can no longer continue living in America that says during the Pledge of Allegiance, justice for all, but then not actually guarantee justice for all. We must put an end to police brutality, racial profiling, white supremacy, and racism in America. We are here today because our laws must boldly affirm that Black lives matter. I want to get to the topic of the case itself, the investigation, and what may or may not happen, because I think that the Justice and Policing Act addresses a lot of the issues that I've seen as a lawyer, a former judge, when some of these cases are handled. I also might add that I served as the first chair of the Police Independent Oversight Board in Houston. I helped Mayor Parker put that together, then she made me chair for 2 years. So I've seen some of these cases, and some of them are tough to make. And in your case, Mr. Floyd, I think that it was good that there was swift action. The police officer was arrested. It took a little time before they arrested the others. But in many cases, the Arbery case, he was out jogging 74 days before an arrest. And just recently we saw in the video that was just released in Williamson County, an incident that happened in March of 2019. The arrest was actually delayed, and the video was even more delayed. They just released it last week, although it happened in March of 2019, a year later. So sometimes it's not quick enough, and then we wonder why. So I wanted to ask first Ms. Eiffel, if she's still with us by video. In terms of investigations, are we adequately addressing the need for an independent investigation in the Justice and Policing Act?
Yes, this is one of the most important parts of the legislation. It is critical that communities feel that these killings and these abuses are investigated by someone who is independent, who is not connected with the local prosecutor's office, and who can bring fresh eyes to bear on whether there was a violation of the Constitution or a violation of criminal law. And in too many places around the country, we have seen these incidents where prosecutors have demonstrated that they are unwilling to robustly lean into an investigation, unwilling to arrest, unwilling to indict, or if they bring the case before the grand jury, we then hear later that the presentation was lackluster and was not the kind of presentation we would expect of a prosecutor. So we need independence.
I want to move quickly if we can.
There is a colossal lack of confidence right now in the justice system, and it is deserved. And as a lawyer, I can say it pains me because I have dedicated my life as a civil rights lawyer to using the law to affect change. But what you are seeing on the streets of this country, all over this country, change. But what you are seeing on the streets of this country, all over this country, is a colossal lack of confidence in the justice system. And it is incumbent upon this body in this legislation to put together the means of restoring that confidence. And that confidence only comes back if the justice system can be said to be fair, can be said to be legitimate, and can be said to produce just results. And when it comes to cases of police killing unarmed African Americans, at this point, we do not have those three.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I did have a question for Mr. Crump and Ms. Gupta, but I'll submit them in writing. I yield back my time.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Neguse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Nadler. Thank you, Chairwoman Bass, members of the committee, and my fellow members of the Congressional Black Caucus for your leadership on this issue. I want to express my deepest condolences to you, Mr. Floyd, and to Ms. Underwood Jacobs as well. I know all of us will continue to keep you and your families in our prayers. What happened to your brother, Mr. Floyd, what happened to Breonna Taylor is truly an outrage. And I pray that together we can meet the moment and we can honor their memories by passing the Justice and Policing Act. And not just honor their memories, but the memories of so many others across the country. In 2016, here in Colorado, Michael Marshall, a 50-year-old, 112-pound black man, was killed by jail deputies. While enduring a psychiatric episode in jail, he was restrained in the prone position by 5 deputies for over 13 minutes, in which time he aspirated on his own vomit and went in and out of consciousness. And more recently, in August of 2019, Elijah McClain, a 23-year-old unarmed black man, died after a physical encounter with the Aurora Police Department while walking home one night. After initially not responding to police, McClain was tackled to the ground by officers, placed in a chokehold, and vomited. He was later given ketamine, suffered a heart attack on the way to the hospital, and ultimately died. And on the body camera recording, you can clearly hear Elijah say, "I can't breathe." These are the same words that we heard Eric Garner say over 6 years ago as he was put in a chokehold by an NYPD officer. They are the same words spoken by Mr. Floyd, who had a knee to his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. It is past time that Congress banned chokeholds and other harmful police tactics that have led to far too many deaths. And that is why the Justice in Policing Act is so important. And I will say that I'm very encouraged by the broad base of support this legislation has received, including from the American Psychological Association. And with unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, I'd ask to submit their statement of support into the record.
Without objection.
As you may know, or rather, I know the chairman's well aware, but as many, as I'm sure, are aware also, data on policing has been particularly deficient for quite some time. And as a result, it has hindered our understanding and our ability to hold law enforcement accountable in real time. We don't know this week how many times an officer used a taser or fired their weapon, or how many times individuals were injured while they were in police custody. This is basic information, and it's critical information to ensuring that such actions are regulated. And that brings me to my first question for Ms. Gupta, which is, how does the mostly volunteer system that we currently have on data collection fail to capture these data points? And second, how does requiring state and local law enforcement to report that data improve accountability?
Thank you, Congressman. It is a real shame that in 2020 we still do not have adequate data collection on use of force in this country. We've had to rely for several years on journalists putting this stuff together at the Washington Post and at the Guardian. The FBI has started to try to more systematically collect it, but this bill, the Justice in Policing Act, actually includes a requirement for states to report use of force data to the Justice Department, including the reason that force was used. Technical assistance grants are established in this bill to assist agencies that have fewer than 100 employees with compliance. That was often the reason that police agencies were not reporting on this, but it also requires the Attorney General to collect data on traffic stops, searches, uses of deadly force by federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies, and to disaggregate that data by race, ethnicity, and gender. There should be no reason why in the United States of America in 2020 we aren't able to collect that kind of data, and these incentives are going to be really important to making sure that we have that data, can learn from it, and can improve and change the culture of policing from it as well.
Thank you, Ms. Gupta, and your testimony certainly underscores why the Justice in Policing Act is so necessary. Thank you again to each of our witnesses for being here today and for testifying. And with that, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. McBath.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank all of our witnesses that are still left. Thank you for being here for so long today. It's really vitally important that we hear from you. But most specifically, I want to say to you, Mr. Floyd, and also to Ms. Underwood Jacobs, I offer you my deepest condolences, because I know exactly how you feel. I know your pain. I can't sit here and say, I can only imagine. I know what you are going through. And Mr. Floyd, I was so grateful to be able to go to your brother's funeral in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And I am so sorry that you are here testifying over the loss of your brother. We come to this hearing today as a result of deep, morally painful wounds and events that happen in this country again and again and again. We come to remember George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the many lives that have been lost to violence at the hands of those with a sworn duty to protect and serve us. We have lost too many of our brothers and our sisters and our mothers and our fathers under these incidences of law enforcement. We know that these recent tragedies are part of a system of racial disparities that have been harming people of color for 400 years. In Georgia, where I represent Georgia's 6th congressional district, we recently lost the life of Ahmaud Arbery, who was pursued by 3 men and chased by 2 pickup trucks and murdered in the streets just miles from his home. As Georgia investigators testified last week that Ahmaud's killer used the N-word as Ahmaud lay dying in the street. The investigator testified that the killer's father, a former police officer, carried a handgun during the pursuit, a handgun that was issued to him by his police department. A handgun that he carried as a police officer, still bearing the initials of the department. I grieve every day for these continued losses. I grieve as a mother who lost her own child to the very same violence that we're talking about today and tomorrow and next week and next month and next year. I lost my son, Jordan, by a man who called him a thug for simply playing loud music in his car. Jordan's tragedy is shockingly similar to Ahmaud Arbery's. Being black while being in your own community. I feel the pain experienced by too many families every single day, and every single day it happens. It's like a sucker punch in my heart and my gut. Because when is it going to stop? I pray every single day for our nation. I pray every single day for every family. And I pray that today we finally do something about it. I know that my time is going to be up, so I'm going to just ask one very quick question. Professor Butler, very briefly, do you think a commission that I have been working on, a commission that would study the social determinants and the effects of young black men and boys in this country, do you believe that that would be justified in creating research and data for this very legislation that we're talking about today?
I think African-American boys and girls desperately need interventions that don't blame them for problems that society causes. So I think that kind of commission is key.
Thank you very, very much. And I know that my time is up, but I am begging everyone here today, I am begging you to stand in the gap. I am begging you to speak up. I am begging you to be a part of solving the problems of all the young black men and women in this country that die every single day, because if you do not, you are complicit. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Stanton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for moving quickly to hold this necessary hearing during a time of significant pain for our nation. And I want to recognize and thank Congresswoman Bass for her leadership to heal that pain. The Justice in Policing Act is an essential first step. Mr. Floyd, I offer my deepest condolences to you and your family. I can't imagine how difficult the last 2 weeks have been, and it is courageous that you are here today. Just yesterday, you laid your brother to rest. But his murder is a tragic reminder that we cannot rest. We have work to do so that George Floyd and Eric Garner, Philando Castile, Walter Scott, Antonio Arce, and too many others will not have died in vain, and that their lives spur us to action. It's been more than 400 years since enslaved Africans were first brought to America's shores, shackled and sold. We are in the midst of a reckoning and facing a very difficult truth, that since that moment, there's not been a single day in which the maxim that our founders knew to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, has been fully recognized by our country for Black Americans. Not a single day in which equal justice under the law has been fully experienced by Black Americans. There is no greater tragedy in our history. And our generation has a choice. We can sustain America's original sin, or we can redeem her and be repairers of the breach. I recognize that the ability to end racism in our country is beyond the reach of this committee. We don't have the power to change every person's heart and mind. But what we can do is address structural racism and enact tangible measures of transparency and accountability in policing that can help make everyone safe. This is a charge that every level of government must take up, from those of us in Congress to everyone who serves on a city council. During my time as the mayor of my hometown, we started a community policing trust initiative, which earned the recognition from the Obama administration's Department of Justice. We enhanced de-escalation training for our officers. We rewrote the guidelines for interacting with our immigrant community. We started putting body-worn cameras on officers on patrol. And then when we saw the positive results, we budgeted for every officer on the beat to wear a camera. But I'll be the first to tell you, there is more work to do in every state, in every city, in every community in America. So I want to ask our distinguished panel specifically about body-worn cameras. In 2014, research by Arizona State University found that officers wearing body cameras were more aware of their actions and sensitive to the scrutiny of the footage by their superiors. And I believe that every police officer on patrol in America ought to be wearing a body-worn camera. Professor Butler, do you believe that body-worn cameras help make members of the public and the police officers safer?
Yeah, absolutely. Without body-worn cameras, there would be 4 killer cops who remained on the police force of Minneapolis.
President Davis, how can body-worn cameras improve training for police officers?
Thank you for the question. In addition to capturing what happens, it allows the police department to go back and look at the everyday encounter, car stops, traffic stops, pedestrian stops, and evaluate the kind of conduct. There's a good study out of Oakland, what Stanford did, to show that how officers engage men and women of color is completely different than how they were engaging non-minorities. So there's a lot to be learned just by watching the day-to-day activities, in addition to capturing the critical incidents that we're talking about.
Thank you. Ms. Eiffel, one of the main challenges with body-worn cameras is that they can be expensive to implement, not just the camera itself, but capturing all the information that the cameras provide. In your view, are they a wise and worthwhile investment for law enforcement agencies?
I think body-worn cameras are vitally important, and I would caution that it is necessary to do more than just impose body-worn cameras. And that means there does need to be attention to the laws that govern who gets to look at that film. In jurisdictions where law enforcement officers get to look at the film before they have to answer questions, then the body-worn camera film is just another tool that assists law enforcement officers in impunity. I think you also have to pay attention to jurisdictions that are embedding facial recognition technology in their body-worn cameras. This presents a very serious privacy concern for communities, and particularly African-American communities. So they're important. They're not the be-all and end-all, because we've seen film. We saw film with Eric Garner. We saw film with Walter Scott, who the officer who killed Walter Scott, who was originally acquitted, or the jury was hung. We know that film is not the be-all and end-all, but it is vital for all of the reasons that have been suggested. And I do want to flag, however, those cautions about what happens with that film is also a question that I would encourage you all to think about answering on the front end.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Dean.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler, and thank you, Chairwoman Bass, for bringing us together and for bringing forward this powerful piece of legislation at a time when our country desperately needs it. I thank all of our witnesses today. I pray that our words and our actions will be worthy of this moment. If anybody has a doubt as to systemic racism in this country, as to inequality based on race in this country, you can look no further than between me and my friend and colleague, Ms. McBath. I'm the mother of 3 white sons. I've never had to have the talk. You were the mother of beautiful Jordan Davis. You had to have the talk. If you doubt there is racism, look no further than the inequality of our life experience. And I mourn with you. My sincere sympathy to Ms. Underwood Jacobs and her family for the loss of her brother. And Mr. Floyd, it is heartbreaking, it is soul-crushing what we witnessed 2.5 weeks ago as the depraved murder of your brother. My sympathy is with you, but more my words and my actions will be with you. The world is watching. Ms. Gupta, I'd like to talk first about the issue of the National Registry. There's been some conversation about it. And I remember the horror of Tamir Rice's murder in 2014, the anger that we all felt, the dismay of a police officer who killed a beautiful little boy. That police officer had been deemed an emotionally unstable and unfit for duty by the police department he had worked at before joining the Cleveland Police. He never disclosed that information in his application. The Cleveland Police never reviewed his previous personnel file before hiring him. We must expect agents of government entrusted with the awesome responsibility of protecting and serving, but also capable of using brutal and deadly force, to be hired under rigorous standards. Do we know how pervasive this problem is of not knowing the background of police officers as they are hired?
There are some registries that associations, regional associations have created, but there is no national registry of this sort that is being proposed in this really important legislation. This is why it is high time that this provision in the Justice and Policing Act be passed. It's time to have a national registry that has this kind of information that could save lives and frankly, also promote community trust. But this national registry would have misconduct complaints, it would have discipline and termination records, it would have records of certification. It contains conditioning for money, for funds, so that agencies actually have to put in inputs before they can access federal money. But it is high time for this to happen.
I was talking this week with my own Attorney General, Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, about the issue of a national registry. He too supports that, but I do know that he has also, as Attorney General, worked with and announced that he wishes to establish and have the legislature in Pennsylvania establish a state registry. I think it's important that my home state is considering that. Should the tracking of disciplinary and performance records of law enforcement be left to the states alone? Is that sufficient, or does it mean that we should do both?
If you just have a patchwork of states that do this, and it's good that states are standing up because right now is a moment where people are demanding change, and so states are beginning to take action. But you will end up with a patchwork that will not be sufficient to actually achieve the bottom line goal of having a registry that would be national, that people move around. They look at jobs in other jurisdictions. And so it isn't enough to have this patchwork. It's time for Congress to act and to create a national kind of rubric for this.
Absolutely. And Mr. Floyd, I'd like to end with you to thank you for your strength for being here today. We can't imagine the exhaustion, the fatigue, the grief. But we are here with you, and the world supports you. I hope that offers you some consolation. And your brother will be remembered worldwide for a very, very, very long time to come. As your niece and his daughter said, my daddy changed the world, and he has, and I'm confident he will. But I'd like to give you an opportunity to tell us not about his death, but about his life. What did you know and love about your big brother? What should we know about his life?
He was a role model for me and a lot of guys coming out the neighborhood, because He was the first one to get a scholarship. We all wanted scholarships, and he was the first one because it was just hard. You had to get either academic scholarship or you would get one playing sports. But he had got him a scholarship, and it made everybody else feel like they can get one too.
He was a talented athlete.
Yes,
And
ma'am.
I think he was a coach to people, wasn't he?
Yes, ma'am. He was the coach. It's just so much about him. Talking with Cyril, I don't know if y'all know him, but anyway. He talked to a lot of kids. He went to a lot of different places, met a lot of people. He went to China, played with Yao Ming, against Yao Ming. He did a lot of different things, and he come back and he share information with us. And it was excited to see him every time because he showed us so much, just a big gentle giant. And he took us to a lot of places. We went to Orlando, went down there and watched the basketball games. He had a lot of friends as athletes, and we just vibed, and he showed us that there's other places in life besides being in the neighborhood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Floyd. I see my time has expired.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I want to start my 5 minutes with a video that I came across, and it really struck a chord. This happened in Miami. The women in the video were worried. They had been threatened by a neighbor who had a shotgun and was making racist slurs. They called 911 for safety and for protection. Instead, they were met with force.
I have to be corrected when my life was just threatened and my daughter's sick. I just want to go to the store and charge my phone.
Please stop. She didn't even do nothing.
Touch me. Do not touch me. Do not touch me.
What
do
the
not record
heck?
this.
I
Do not
am.
touch me.
What the? Why are you doing that? Why are you doing that?
Do not touch
Why are you
me.
doing
Do
that?
not touch me.
She's
I
not
just
doing
said
nothing.
I wanted to call my kids. I just said I wanted to call my kids. My phone is dead. What do you not understand? I got a gun pointed in front of me, and my kids is sick. I'm stressed out. I need to go call my children.
Conduct like this is never acceptable. The woman was unarmed. She called 911 because she felt threatened. She called 911 hoping that police officers would come to protect her. And instead, you saw those images. The officer in this video later lied about what happened on the police report and is now facing charges of misconduct and battery. Let me tell you, this happened only 2 months ago. There was no reason to subject someone to excessive force because of the color of their skin. And the reality is that people of color live and face these prejudices throughout their entire lives. They face discrimination. It's ingrained in our culture since the very founding of our country. And we have to confront this crisis head on. Currently, right now, there is absolutely no national standard to require police officers to de-escalate and avoid the use of excessive force. We have to eliminate the injustices that Black men and women and communities of color face everywhere, in our government, in our society, in our healthcare system, and specifically in the police systems that we have seen for decades. I can also tell you that from my own personal experience, this is not representative of every police officer. I have very close relationships with law enforcement in Miami. Officer Tooks, McCombie, Officer Demps, they are part of the community. They have earned the trust of the community. But we have to start by accepting that there is racial bias in our police system. We have to accept that. I continue to hear from members of this administration that there's no racism, that there's no racial bias. And that is not true. Racism is systemic, and we have to hold our police departments accountable and demand transparency. To do that, we have to engage with the community through civilian oversight. Civilian oversight boards build bridges between police and communities by giving the people a voice in the policies that affect them. They ensure officer accountability through fair and open investigation, and over time, they build trust. Civilian oversight has to be done correctly, however. They have to be independent, they have to have subpoena power, they must have the authority to conduct investigations into police misconduct, and most importantly, civilian oversight boards have to represent the diversity in the community. Its seats need to be filled not by political appointees, but with local citizens and the leaders of local organizations focused on community policing and accountability. So I'm proud that the Justice and Policing Act promotes civilian oversight and allows federal funding to go toward building civilian review boards. So my first question is to Mr. Ron Davis. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned in your testimony the need for police to collaborate with the community to redefine and reimagine policing, and that includes a new system that fosters civilian oversight. Can you please explain why civilian oversight is an important factor in preventing police brutality and is effective in holding police accountable?
Yes, Congresswoman, and thank you for the call. I'll refer back to, I think as one of your colleagues mentioned, Sir Robert Peel, the 10 principles, or some called the 9 principles of law enforcement. And one of them says that police only police or use their authority with the consent of people. And the best way to have the consent is you need the checks and balances to make sure that those, for our police officers, myself included when I was serving, to have such enormous and awesome power, the power to take freedom, the power to take life, are held accountable with a check and balance system so that there is trust, that there's legitimacy, and that there's accountability. So civilian oversight provides that extra layer, the same way we want independent prosecutors, independent investigations of lawful shootings. To have an independent civilian oversight body is a checks and balance so that the awesome power that the police are given by the community is accountable. We're accountable for that, and that we then police with the consent of the people, and that's the only way we can be effective. So there are varying models with it, but I think in general, the core principle of civilian oversight does go towards community policing. It makes the police and the community producers of public safety, both responsible, both being accountable, and it's the best form of oversight that you can have.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. And Mr. Floyd, thank you so much for joining us today. Losing someone in a violent manner and having footage of that has to be the most devastating way of losing someone. So I share with all my colleagues here today my deepest condolences to you and the family, and we're here for anything that you need. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of the witnesses who have appeared today. I, too, extend my condolences to Ms. Underwood Jacobs on the loss of her brother, and to you, Mr. Floyd, on the loss of your brother, and we'll continue to keep you and your family in my thoughts and prayers. I hope you recognize, Mr. Floyd, that the brutal murder of your brother has awakened the conscience of this country. And it has resulted in people all across America raising their voices and demanding an end to racial injustice, an end to police brutality, particularly against Black Americans and other communities of color, and for the creation of a safe, effective policing model for every single person in this country that will improve public safety and also the safety and effectiveness of police work. The tragedy is these are not new problems that we're experiencing. Your brother's death is only the most recent example of ugly racism and police brutality that have been a stain on the soul of this nation since our founding. I think everyone in this hearing brings their own experiences. And so before I was in politics, I was a civil rights lawyer, and most of my cases were police brutality cases. And so many of the hurdles that I've faced in bringing those cases and seeking justice are addressed in the Justice and Policing Act. I then became mayor of the city of Providence and inherited a police department that was under a patterns of practice investigation by the Department of Justice. A police department that was really at war with the community. Crime was on the increase and the public had lost confidence in that community. And one of the things that was so effective in turning around that was the participation of the community and working in partnership with the police. We produced the lowest crime rate in 40 years. We became a fully accredited police department, and the police officers became integrated into the communities they served. And so one of the things that I'm really concerned about is during the Trump administration has changed the policies about these patterns and practice investigations. It was one of the things that we were able to use to force change that the chief and the department and I as the mayor wanted. Under the Obama administration, the Justice Department opened 25 investigations into police departments, signed and enforced over a dozen consent decrees in places as diverse as Ferguson, Seattle, New Orleans, and had several open investigations. And the Trump administration then came in and really changed positions on that. And I know, Ms. Gupta, you're familiar with that. What has been the impact of the decision of the Trump administration not to pursue patterns and practice investigations? And this legislation not only strengthens the ability of DOJ to do that, but also gives that responsibility to state attorneys general. Can you speak a little bit about why that's necessary and why this is such a powerful mechanism for changing police departments and reforming police departments?
Yeah, the Trump DOJ has essentially abandoned and abdicated a mandate that was given by Congress in 1994 to investigate patterns and practices of systemic unconstitutional policing in police departments around the country. Since the administration began, there has been the opening only of one on a very tiny issue at a police department out of Springfield, Massachusetts, compared to 25 in the Obama administration and many others in Republican and Democratic administrations prior to that. And so what that has meant is that the tool of these investigations, the tool of the consent decrees, has just been lying dormant. Typically, when I oversaw the Civil Rights Division, we had mayors and police chiefs that really, in numerous instances, were actually asking the Justice Department to come in because they needed federal help in very bad situations. And so jurisdictions have not been able to rely anymore on the Justice Department to support these kinds of efforts. And I think this bill, Justice and Policing, does a lot to strengthen the Civil Rights Division's authority, giving it subpoena power, giving it resources. It also gives state attorneys general the ability to do these pattern and practices where they have already state laws that allow them to do it as well. And that's, of course, in this moment, with a Justice Department that is very disengaged from these issues, an important thing.
Thank you. And Professor Butler, very quickly, because I only have a little time left. I'm also very interested in the accreditation model because I think that's a way to help transform the police departments all across the country quickly. And I'm wondering whether or not you have a view as to whether or not the provisions that provide for training to end racial bias and to end racial profiling, whether there are really high-quality components of an accreditation system that can really effect systematic change.
I think they're essential. We've gotten away from being tough on crime. We're now about being smart on crime. It's evidence-based practices. The evidence suggests that police can do better with appropriate training.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent request. I ask unanimous consent that an article entitled, "It's Official, the Trump Administration Will Pull Back from Investigating Police Abuses" be made part of the record.
Without objection.
Another article entitled, "The Trump Administration Gave Up on Federal Oversight of Police Agencies Just as It Was Starting to Work."
Without objection.
And a final article entitled, "Trump and Session Released Cops from Federal Oversight. Now we see the results."
Without objection.
And with that, Mr. Chairman, I just want to end where I began, with deep gratitude to Mr. Floyd for the courage and the grace that you have shown and for being such an inspiration to us. And I only pray and hope that my colleagues in the Congress of the United States will have the same courage and will be inspired to do the right thing and to respond in this historic way to really change the way communities and police relate, and that will all be done to honor the life and legacy of your brother. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Without objection, the following materials concerning the Justice and Policing Act and related issues, which have been submitted to the committee's electronic repository, will be included in the record. A number of leading civil rights organizations, statements by the Fraternal Order of Police, the Constitutional Accountability Center, the Players Coalition, the YWCA, Adobe, Third Way, the National Partnership for Women and Families, the Blue Dog Coalition, and articles in Reuters and Boston Globe will be admitted into the record without objection. I want to thank our witnesses for participating in today's hearing, in particular, Mr. Floyd, with whom we have the greatest sympathy and thanks. That concludes today's hearing. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. Without objection, the hearing is adjourned.